Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Evan Carter. I'm 28 years old. This happened in September of 2023, and even now I'm not entirely sure how much of it was real. Only that it hurt like hell, both physically and mentally, and that I haven't been the same since. I decided that summer, on an impulse, to prove something to myself. I was tired of my life in Seattle, tired of spending my days cooped up in a tiny office with fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry flies over my desk. I had just enough savings for a plane ticket to Fairbanks, and enough vacation days saved up to risk a 10-day solo hike through gates of the Arctic National Park. I had read about the Brooks Range, how vast and untouched it was, how it could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. The idea of facing that challenge alone felt like the perfect crucible to test my limits. I wasn't a veteran outdoorsman by any stretch. I'd done some weekend camping trips around Mount Rainier, even did a 3-day trek in the Cascades with a friend, but nothing this extreme. My husky, Blue, was my constant companion. She'd never been on anything this long either, but huskies are tough, and she thrived in cold climates. I figured between her sharp instincts and my gear, we'd manage. I thought I'd done my homework. Looking back, I see how naive I was. How unprepared for the scale of real wilderness. We flew to Fairbanks in early September, caught a smaller flight to Bettles, and from there arranged a drop-off point near the park's outskirts. The pilot, a grizzled man named Chuck with sun-leathered skin, looked me up and down, then gave Blue a pat on the head. "Sure you're ready for this?" he asked. I must have looked like a clueless city boy. "I'll be fine," I replied, forcing confidence into my voice. "I've done all the research, I've got the gear." Chuck raised an eyebrow, but he didn't press the issue. He left me, my large backpack, and Blue in a patch of scrubby tundra with endless mountains rising in the distance. "I'll be back in 10 days, he said. "If weather's good, be at the pickup point or you'll have to hike out on foot." I nodded. I remember feeling a surge of adrenaline as I watched him take off. The small plane turning into a speck in the cloud-wreathed sky. Then it was just me and the hush of Alaskan wilderness, and Blue wagging her tail, sniffing the air with a bright curiosity. The rolling foothills stretched out before us, leading into the jagged silhouettes of the Brooks Range, still dotted with patches of old snow. I took a deep breath, inhaling cold, clean air, a world away from my cubicle in Seattle. We made good progress for the first day and a half. The weather held steady, crisp but not brutal. I had a GPS device, but I also carried the physical topographic maps. I had my phone too, though I didn't expect much signal. I wanted to document the experience, so I took photos of the sweeping vistas, of Blue with her tongue lolling out happily, of the salmonberry shrubs that I recognized from a nature guide. At night, we set up my one-person tent, and a small additional shelter for Blue. I built a campfire, boiled water to rehydrate my freeze-dried meals, and just listened. Usually, I heard a breeze through low brush, the scuttling of small critters, and my own heartbeat pounding with excitement. On the second night, everything changed. It started as a small thing. My GPS device blinked out around dusk, only to blink back on with the coordinates reading something nonsensical, like I was hundreds of miles north, near the Arctic Ocean. I turned it off, chalking it up to a glitch. Then, Blue started acting oddly. She sat bolt upright, hackles raised, staring into the darkness beyond the flickering edge of my campfire. It was the kind of stare that makes you uneasy, the kind that says there's something out there you can't see. I called her name quietly. "Blue, girl, come here." She didn't budge. There was a rustling in the bushes, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it around. Nothing. No glowing animal eyes, no shape. Just empty wilderness and the faint outlines of shrubs and stunted black spruce. The wind picked up then, carrying a sound that might have been the distant cry of a night bird or the whistle of the breeze through rocks. It echoed strangely, almost sounding like a human voice calling something. I told myself it was just my imagination. Blue eventually lay back down, but every so often she'd jerk her head up and growl low in her throat. I fed the fire a bit more wood, wanting its light and warmth to push back whatever fear was creeping into my gut. I was planning a total of 10 days. That was day 2. By the end of day 3, I started to realize something was off. My phone was dead, drained to 0, even though I'd charged it with a portable solar panel that morning. My backups read similarly low. The GPS, which had come back online, now insisted that it was Tuesday, but I knew it should have been Thursday by then. My paper map was still reliable, but that was cold comfort when the rest of my electronics were failing me. That evening, I actually saw another human being. I was near a shallow stream collecting water when I spotted him on the opposite bank. A man, lean, wearing a heavy jacket and carrying a large backpack. He had a deep scar on his cheek and his dark hair was cropped short. He waved in my direction. Blue immediately began wagging her tail, and that sense of relief you get upon seeing another person in the wild surged through me. We called across to each other, me yelling, "Hey," and him shouting, "Hello," over the rushing water. We found a spot where the stream was narrow, and he hopped across, nimble as a goat. He introduced himself as Tommy Grayson, 34, from Montana. He was out here alone doing a spiritual journey to test his limits, or so he said. We decided to camp together for the night since it was already late afternoon and both of us preferred the safety of numbers. At the campfire, we exchanged stories, mostly about our backgrounds, why we loved nature enough to risk a trip like this. Tommy said he'd already been out for nearly 2 weeks and was making a return loop back toward Bettles. What struck me as odd was the timeline of his trip. He claimed to have been near the exact foothills I'd traversed the day before, but had seen my campsite a day prior to that. At first, I dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Maybe we were referencing different locations. But he was very specific about the landmarks, the shape of the ridge I'd camped under, even the arrangement of rocks around my fire pit. He insisted that was the night before last, while I knew for a fact I'd only set up camp there less than 24 hours ago. Tommy just shrugged and said, "This place can mess with your head, time, memory. It's weird out here." I laughed a little, though it didn't feel funny. Blue nuzzled up to him, which reassured me. She could be a decent judge of character. We turned in, each in our own tents with a shared fire between us. In the middle of the night, I woke abruptly. There was no sound of Tommy snoring or breathing. I poked my head out of my tent. His tent flap was unzipped, but it was too dark to see inside. I whispered, "Tommy, you there?" No answer, just the crackling of dying embers. Blue was lying beside me, alert, her ears pricked. I pulled on my boots and jacket, stepping out into the frigid night. Tommy's tent was indeed empty. His sleeping bag was still there, as were his backpack and boots. He hadn't taken any of his gear. Where the hell would he go in the middle of the night without boots? The only hint of his passing was a single set of footprints leading off toward the tree line, but I lost them once they hit firmer ground. I spent a good hour searching around with my flashlight, calling his name in a low voice so as not to attract bears or anything else. There was no sign of him. Eventually, shivering and unnerved, I gave up and lay back down in my tent, though I got little sleep. By morning, Tommy was still gone. His gear was untouched. I debated waiting for him to return, but part of me was too spooked to stick around that spot. I know that might sound heartless. I was worried about him, but the fear of encountering whatever he had encountered and the strangeness of that entire situation was stronger. I packed up my gear, leaving a note weighted by a rock, telling him which direction I was heading. If he came back, he'd see it. It was the best I could do. Blue and I pressed on northward, following a valley that should lead to a pass through the mountains, based on my map. That day was grueling. The weather turned for the worse, with a biting wind and sporadic flurries of snow. My progress slowed, and I was painfully aware that I hadn't left enough margin for error in my schedule. I forced myself onward, telling Blue, "We can do this, girl," even though my confidence was waning. Twice that day, I thought I spotted a figure in the distance, standing still at the edge of my vision. Whenever I looked through my binoculars, all I saw were rocks or low shrubs. A trick of the light, maybe. The land was so stark, and illusions could come easily to an anxious mind. More than once, Blue turned and growled at nothing behind us, the fur along her spine bristling. Each time, I felt this primal shiver of fear, like something was watching from just beyond my sight. On the 5th night, I set up camp near a small lake. The water was partially frozen around the edges. I was exhausted, physically and mentally. After I fed Blue, I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to chase away the cold that seeped into my bones. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew it was pitch black, my fire reduced to embers, and I heard a distinct click noise, like someone stepping on a broken twig. I bolted upright. Blue was nowhere to be found inside my tent. "Blue?" I whispered, fumbling for my flashlight. I emerged into the dark night and found her small shelter empty. Panic gripped my chest. I called her name again, rummaging frantically for my boots, half lacing them as I stumbled out into the open. My flashlight beam cut across the stunted trees, illuminating nothing but twisted branches. I swung it around, heart hammering. Then I saw her in the distance, only about 30 feet away. She was sitting perfectly still, facing away from me. I called her name. She didn't turn. Instead, she stayed frozen like a statue. I hurried toward her. "Blue," I repeated, my voice hushed but urgent. As I got closer, the flashlight revealed her slack posture and wide-open eyes. She wasn't blinking. My flashlight caught the reflective shine in her pupils, but they didn't move or narrow. It was as though she was a stuffed animal. My stomach twisted. She was breathing, but very shallowly. I reached out, my voice trembling. "Blue girl, what's wrong?" The moment my hand touched her fur, there was a rustling behind me. I spun around and shone my light. I saw another shape in the darkness. An animal shape, but limping, hunched. The reflection in its eyes was red, not the usual golden green that dog eyes have under a light. It growled, low, guttural, and staggered forward. In horror, I realized it looked just like Blue. Same coat, same body shape, but it was injured. Blood was matted into its fur, and it held one paw off the ground at an awkward angle. A wave of impossibility washed over me. I had Blue right here, seemingly catatonic, yet there was the same dog in front of me, wounded. That injured dog thing tilted its head, then bared its teeth in a too-human grin. Slowly, it backed away until it melted into the darkness. I stood there, shaking, my hands clammy around the flashlight. I turned back to the unresponsive Blue, gently shook her shoulder. She blinked once, like waking from a trance, then started whining in confusion. At least she recognized me. I carried her back to our camp. She seemed to snap out of it quickly, though she was trembling. My mind raced. Could that have been a wolf that just resembled her? Could I have been hallucinating from exhaustion or hypothermia? But I knew what I saw. A creature that was identical to my dog and yet obviously wrong. My heart wouldn't stop pounding for hours. The next morning, things got even stranger. My backpack had vanished from inside my tent. All my food, some of my extra clothing, my water purifier gone. After a frantic search, I found it half buried in snow about 30 yards away, a set of footprints in the frost leading right to it. The footprints were human, but weirdly spaced, like someone walking on all fours or with a strange gait. Worse, when I opened the pack, most of my supplies were destroyed. The water purifier was snapped in two, my freeze-dried packs torn open and scattered, their contents fouled by the damp ground. My first thought was that an animal got in there, maybe a wolverine, but the footprints were definitely human in shape. I cursed and kicked the ground in frustration. Now I was in real trouble. Limited food, no purifier. There was snow to melt, sure, but I had to ration my stove fuel. My mind reeled at the prospect of having to cut the trip short. Still, I told myself I could manage. I'd read about survival skills, I had purification tablets for backup, and I could hunt small game. I tried to calm my shaking hands as I repacked what was salvageable. Midway through that morning, my map started to feel unreliable as well. Landmarks didn't seem to match up exactly. Ridges I expected to see on my left were on my right, and my compass needle spun or pointed due north no matter how I turned. I told myself it was interference from minerals in the rock. But that rational explanation didn't ease the dread building in my chest. Even Blue was on edge, constantly glancing over her shoulder. I pressed on, deciding that my best bet was to head southeast toward a known ranger station that might be staffed at this time of year. According to the official maps, it was about 3 days' hike away if I kept a strong pace, but that was assuming I didn't get lost again. That night, I found a relatively sheltered spot beneath a rocky overhang. The wind howled, bitterly cold, and I only managed to get a small fire going. It sputtered and sparked in odd colors, sometimes a burst of green or blue flame. I told myself it was just some chemical in the wood or fungus. Still, it didn't feel right. Somewhere around midnight I heard footsteps outside my tent. Not animal steps, human steps, deliberate, crunching through the gravel. I froze, heart pounding. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight. There stood Tommy. He looked almost exactly as he had that first night. Except now he wore no gloves despite the cold, and the scar on his cheek seemed more pronounced. His eyes caught the light in a bizarre way, reflecting it back like an animal's would. He smiled, but something about that smile was off. It stretched too wide, showing too many teeth. I spoke first, even though terror clogged my throat. "Tommy, God, I've been worried about you. Where did you go?" He paused for a long moment, as if considering how to answer. Blue poked her head out of the tent behind me, letting out a low, continuous growl. Tommy's eyes slid past me and settled on Blue. That grin never faltered. "I'm glad I found you," he said, voice calm, almost pleasant. "I got lost for a while." I noticed he wasn't blinking as much as a person normally would. He barely blinked at all. "Where's your gear?" I asked, glancing around, my flashlight sweeping across empty tundra. No sign of a pack, sleeping bag, anything. He shrugged. Didn't need it anymore. My mouth went dry. Blue's growl intensified. "Tommy," I said carefully, You left all your stuff behind. You disappeared in the middle of the night. I've been calling for you. Are you okay? Are you hurt?" He cocked his head as though the question was strange. "I'm fine," he said. "Better than fine." Then he lifted one foot, showing me the sole of his boot. A chunk of it had worn away, and beneath the frayed edges, I swear I saw something pale and moist, like raw flesh. "I came to help you," he continued. "It's easy to get turned around out here." I wanted to back away, but something about him hypnotized me with fear. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Maybe we should rest. We can find a route back together in the morning." "Yes," he replied, still smiling that impossible grin. In the morning, he stepped closer, and my flashlight flickered, almost dying. I thought I saw his skin ripple along his neck, like something under the surface was shifting. Blue suddenly lunged at him, teeth bared. She snapped at his ankle. Tommy jumped back with unnerving speed, hissed at her, actually hissed, like a cornered cat. Then he turned and bounded away, disappearing into the night. I fell to my knees, heart drumming like a machine gun in my chest. My dog whined and pressed against me, her body trembling. I had no idea how to process what I'd just seen. It was Tommy, but not. My rational mind wanted to label it a dream or an extreme stress-induced hallucination. But my gut told me the truth. Something was wearing Tommy's face. Or maybe it was Tommy, changed by whatever lurked in this place. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the sputtering fire, knife in hand, petting Blue's fur to calm both of us. Day 7. My food supply was in critical shape, the weather was worsening, and I was increasingly disoriented by the terrain. Sometimes I'd crest a hill. Sure, I'd see a certain valley, but the valley would be gone. Or a stream I crossed hours before would reappear. My watch's time didn't match the sun's position, and more than once I noticed entire hours vanish in the blink of an eye. Blue wouldn't leave my side, leaning into me whenever I stopped, eyes darting around as if anticipating another confrontation. At some point, I realized that my own memory was fracturing. I'd try to recall the date, and my brain swam with confusion. Was I supposed to meet Chuck in 3 days, or had that time already passed? My phone was completely dead, and the portable charger refused to work. My maps seemed jumbled, the lines on the topographic sheets looking like scribbles or shifting slopes that made no sense. When I compared them to the terrain, the shapes were wrong, bigger or smaller or reversed. Late in the afternoon, I came across a harrowing sight. I saw a shape ahead, slumped near a rocky outcrop. Approaching cautiously, I found what appeared to be human remains. The body was half-eaten, the torso torn open, limbs twisted unnaturally. I nearly vomited, turning away in horror. Blue growled at the air, her nose wrinkling at the stench. After a moment, I managed to look again, forcing myself to see if it was Tommy or someone else I could identify. The face was unrecognizable, mauled beyond recognition. The eyes gouged out. Rigor mortis had set in, so the corpse had been there for at least a day. The only clue was a scrap of a jacket that looked like the one Tommy wore, but it could have been any brand, I wasn't sure. Either way, it was a chilling revelation that something was out here, something capable of this brutality, or perhaps Tommy himself. But I couldn't bring myself to finish that thought. I left the gruesome discovery and trudged on, each step feeling heavier. Darkness settled early, the clouds blocking out the sun. I made a meager camp in a patch of willow shrubs, lashing branches together for a windbreak. My stomach rumbled with hunger, but I forced myself to ration the little food I had left. I cradled Blue's face in my hands, staring into her bright eyes. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, more to myself than to her. That night, sleep finally took me, though my mind was racked with the nightmares of being chased by a too long-limbed figure wearing Tommy's face. I dreamed of hearing my own voice in the distance, calling out for help, mocking me. I jolted awake in the early hours, heart pounding. The moon was out, giving the snow and rocks a pale glow. I stepped out of my tent and saw a set of footprints circling the campsite. They weren't mine. They weren't dog prints. They were barefoot, human footprints, and they seemed to radiate away in every direction, as though whoever made them had walked around the tent multiple times, sometimes on 2 feet, sometimes on 4. The knowledge that I had slept through that chilled me to the marrow. By day 8, exhaustion and fear weighed down every movement. My sense of time felt completely warped. My watch read 7:15 a.m., but the sun was high overhead, suggesting mid-morning at least, and the date on the watch insisted it was September 3rd, which didn't make sense. I'd started the hike on September 1st, and I should have been on day 8 by now. The lines between real and unreal blurred dangerously. In the afternoon, as I trudged through a shallow gorge, my feet slipping on loose stones, I heard a voice echo off the cliffs. It sounded like my own voice calling, "Help me." I froze. Blue barked sharply at me as if to say, "Don't you dare go toward that sound." But a compulsion, morbid curiosity or insane hope, pushed me to investigate. I scrambled up one side of the gorge and looked across the expanse. Standing on the opposite cliff edge was the figure I recognized as Tommy. He stared at me, unsmiling. Then he mouthed words. I couldn't hear them, but I read his lips. "Come here." I stumbled back in fear, nearly losing my balance. When I steadied myself and looked again, he was gone. That evening, I set up my tent with Blue tethered to me by a short lead so she couldn't wander away. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted, and a bitter wind cut through my jacket. I tried to keep my fire going, but the flames sputtered and died no matter how much kindling I used. Then the weird colors came back, little bursts of green and purple in the embers. I decided to climb into my sleeping bag and ride out the night as best I could. Sometime around midnight, I was startled awake by Blue's frantic barking. She was outside my tent, her lead taut. I heard movement, heavy footsteps. I scrambled out, knife in hand. My flashlight revealed a horrific scene. Tommy, or something that wore Tommy's shape, had Blue by the scruff of her neck. His face was contorted, eyes wide with that animal shine. He must have yanked her away from the tent, snapping part of the lead. Blue howled, snapping at him, but he moved with unnatural speed and precision. "No!" I screamed. Lunging forward, I slashed with my knife, catching him across the arm. He recoiled, letting go of Blue. She collapsed onto the ground, whimpering in pain. Tommy turned those reflective eyes on me. I could see the gash in his arm, deep and bleeding, yet he acted like he barely felt it. He let out a strange rasping laugh and lunged at me. What followed was pure chaos. I remember stumbling backward, the flashlight tumbling from my grasp. My vision was a swirl of darkness, shapes, and the silver gleam of moonlight on snow. Tommy grabbed at my shoulders, fingers digging in painfully. I slashed again, aiming for his chest. I felt the blade bite into flesh, but he only hissed, his grip tightening. His face so close to mine, I could smell his breath, rancid, like rotting meat. Blue mustered her strength and lunged at him again, this time snapping her jaws around his calf. He howled and let me go, twisting to shake her off. Blood splattered on the snow, black under the moonlight. I scrambled to grab my flashlight, shining it on them. That's when I saw something that still haunts my nightmares. Beneath the torn flesh of Tommy's calf, I glimpsed bone. And that bone was riddled with tiny fissures, like something was writhing inside it. With a final savage jerk, Tommy flung Blue off his leg. She hit the ground hard, yelping. He stooped over her and, with impossible strength, snapped her neck. The sound was sharp and echoing. For a moment, I was frozen in horror, my mind refusing to process what had just happened. My beloved companion, my best friend, lay crumpled and still on the frozen ground. Then a red haze filled my vision. I screamed and plunged my knife at Tommy. He caught my wrist. With that same unnatural, fluid motion, he twisted my arm behind me. The pain was instant and white-hot, and I went down on one knee. My breath came in ragged gasps. His face was centimeters from mine, mouth twisted in that ghastly grin, eyes reflecting the moonlight like some predator. I mustered every ounce of strength I had and slammed my forehead into his nose. He reeled back, giving me just enough space to break his grip and thrust my knife forward again, this time aiming higher. The blade sank deep into his shoulder. A spurt of blackish blood gushed out, but still, he didn't go down. He glared at me, a low growl emanating from his chest, then let out a laugh, more a series of choking clicks than anything human. I yanked the knife free, aware of my own tears streaming down my face in grief and fury over Blue. He lunged for me again, but I ducked, letting his momentum carry him past. I spun around and stabbed him once more, in the back this time, burying the blade to the hilt. I felt something crack beneath the steel. Tommy, or the thing wearing him, dropped to one knee, gasping. I seized the moment, my survival instincts kicking in. I grabbed what little gear I could, my jacket, my boots half-laced, and ran. I ran into the night, tears freezing on my cheeks, blood pounding in my ears, grief threatening to strangle me. I don't remember how long I ran. The cold bit into my exposed skin, and my body was numb with shock and exhaustion. Eventually, I slowed to a stumbling walk, glancing behind me every few steps, convinced that Tommy, alive or undead, would be right on my heels. The night seemed endless, the moon high and uncaring, the landscape a blur of rock and ice. By what felt like dawn, I found myself at the edge of a cliff. Below was a raging river, half choked with ice. The roaring water was both a threat and a lure. There was nowhere else to go. Behind me, I heard footsteps again. When I turned, Tommy stood there, or some version of him. One side of his face was torn, revealing cords of muscle. His left arm hung at an odd angle, but he still moved forward, unstoppable. I realized I had lost my knife somewhere during my frenzied flight. I had no weapon. My voice came out in a cracked whisper, "What are you?" His reply was garbled, like multiple voices overlapping, some deeper, some higher pitched. I caught only fragments. We, always, hungry. Then he laughed again, that unnatural sound sending revulsion through me. With no other choice, I scrambled back onto a narrow ledge at the cliff's edge. Tommy advanced until he was just a few feet away. His eyes locked on mine. He lunged for me, and I hurled myself off the cliff. I don't remember the impact with the water, just an explosion of cold so intense it felt like knives stabbing every inch of my skin. The current whisked me away, tumbling me through rapids and chunks of ice. I slammed into rocks, my legs scraped raw, my lungs burning. I struggled to keep my head above water, but at some point everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I was on a gravel bank. Wet clothes frozen stiff around me. My body ached in ways I didn't think possible. Every muscle was bruised, my limbs near numb with hypothermia. I coughed up water and moaned, my voice echoing in the stillness. Dim sunlight filtered through overcast skies, so I guessed it was daytime, though I had no idea which day. My immediate concern was survival. I had to build a fire, change out of my soaked clothes. But I'd lost almost everything, including my pack and supplies. Somehow, by a miracle of stubborn will, I gathered driftwood and used the last working lighter from my pocket to start a small fire. The flames hurt. My fingers had gone half frozen, so returning circulation was agony. I shivered violently, teeth chattering so hard they felt like they'd crack. Gradually, warmth seeped into my bones, though my left ankle was twisted, and I had nasty lacerations on my arms and chest. Once I was stable enough to move, I started walking along the riverbank, limping, leaning on a makeshift crutch I'd fashioned out of a branch. My mind buzzed with pain and loss. Blue was gone. The memory of her death cut me deeper than any physical wound. I felt numb, as if my heart had frozen over. Shock carried me forward. At some point, I stumbled upon a dirt track or a faint trail. I followed it until I spotted a wooden sign half buried in snow. My eyes, blurred with exhaustion, made out the words, "Ranger Station, 5 miles. 5 miles." That might as well have been 100 in my state, but it was a glimmer of hope. I pressed on, step by agonizing step. I reached the station by what felt like nightfall. Smoke curled from the chimney. My entire body shook with relief. I staggered to the door and pounded on it. A ranger, a middle-aged woman with a lined face and kind brown eyes, opened it. Her expression shifted from annoyance at the late knock to shock at my half-dead appearance. She hauled me inside, calling for her colleague to help. They wrapped me in blankets, gave me hot coffee and something to eat. I think I passed out multiple times. Eventually, they got enough sense out of me to understand I'd been lost, attacked, that I needed medical care. The next few hours were fuzzy. The Rangers radioed for assistance. A snowmobile arrived. I was half carried onto it. The ranger with the brown eyes looked pale as she asked me if there was anyone else out there. I remember muttering, "He's still out there." And then I saw something in the reflection of the station's window. My own face, pale and gaunt. But the face in the glass didn't blink when I did. For a moment, I thought I saw the corners of its mouth curl up in a grin. I jerked away, mind reeling, and the reflection returned to normal. As they loaded me onto the snowmobile, the ranger said quietly, "Evan, you've been missing for 3 months." I tried to protest. I'd only been out 10 days at most, but I saw the confusion and pity in her eyes, and I felt a hollow ring of truth in the pit of my stomach. They took me to a hospital. I spent weeks recovering from exposure, dehydration, and injuries. Search parties combed the area for Tommy and for any sign of other missing hikers, but as far as I know, they found nothing definitive. They found some torn gear in places that didn't make sense for me to have traveled. They found scattered footprints, most of them impossible to identify. They never found Blue's body or Tommy's. Chuck, the pilot, confirmed I'd been dropped off when I said, but the timeline of my rescue made no sense. Even now, back in Seattle, the doctors and psychologists push me to talk about my experiences, to find closure. But there is no closure for me. I've tried telling myself it was all a hallucination or that I was delirious from hunger and cold. Yet, in the dark corners of my mind, I remember the exact timbre of Tommy's voice, his bone shining through the wounds, the glint of something alive in his blood. I remember how the land itself seemed to warp reality, how time stopped making sense. Sometimes I wake at night, certain I hear Blue's whine in the living room. I rush out to check, heart pounding, only to find emptiness. The final blow came when I found the small camera I'd taken with me. It had been in my jacket pocket, water damaged but partially salvageable. There were only 4 pictures that hadn't corrupted. One of them showed me and Blue on the first day, bright smiles. Another showed the sweeping vista of the Brooks Range. The third was a blurred shot of Tommy sitting by our fire, his face half turned toward the lens. The fourth made my blood run cold. It was a close-up of me, asleep in my tent, taken from just inches away. My eyes were closed, but I recognized my jacket and the faint glow of the dying fire behind me. I never took that photo. I have no idea who did. So I live with the nightmares, the swirling doubts, and the certainty that something out there in the Alaskan wilderness defies explanation. Sometimes I catch my reflection in a window or a mirror, and I swear my eyes shine back with that same unnerving light I saw in Tommy's. I blink, and it's gone, but the fear remains. If you're reading this and you ever think to test yourself in the far north, heed my warning. The wilderness can break reality, twist it in ways you can't imagine. And if you hear your own voice calling out from the dark, don't answer. Don't follow. I escaped, but a part of me never left those mountains. And something, maybe that thing that wore Tommy's face, followed me home. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 31 years old, and this happened in August of 2023. I'm putting it all down here because it still feels unreal, like I wandered through a nightmare. But I swear, every word is true. There are things out there in the wild that can't be explained, and I was unlucky enough to meet one of them. I grew up in Seattle, living a quiet life with a safe job as an accountant. I wasn't exactly an outdoorsman. In fact, my idea of roughing it had always been a cabin rental with running water. But after a messy breakup with a long-term girlfriend, I got it in my head that I needed to prove something to myself. Call it a crisis of self-worth. Call it heartbreak, whatever it was. I decided I should do a solo trek in the remote wilderness of Alaska. The plan was to spend a week hiking near Foggy Bay, a place I'd read about in an old travel magazine. I brought my Alaskan Malamute, Ghost, a big, muscular dog with a knack for sensing my moods. He was my only companion. I'd had Ghost for 2 years, ever since I found him as a stray in a Seattle suburb. He looked lost, hungry, matted fur and bones protruding like he'd been out on his own for weeks. But there was kindness in his eyes. I took him in, nursed him back to health, and he repaid me by becoming the most loyal friend I'd ever had. Even if I'd never been a big nature guy, having Ghost along gave me a sense of security. His presence was comforting, and I figured if anything went seriously wrong, at least I'd have him for protection and for company. We flew into Ketchikan, then took a small charter boat out to Foggy Bay. The plan was to hike inland and explore the forests, eventually making a loop back to the coast for our pickup in exactly a week. The boat captain, a grizzled man named Gordon, offered me a final piece of advice as we unloaded. You see anything that doesn't look right out there, you turn back. People vanish in these woods. I forced a laugh, thinking he was playing up local legends. But the solemn look in his eyes told me he was serious. The first day was eerily beautiful. The old spruce and hemlock trees towered over mossy ground. A light mist clung to the undergrowth, drifting and swirling around my legs as Ghost and I made our way along a narrow game trail. I felt brave, alive. The heartbreak I had been nursing for weeks seemed to fade with every step. The air smelled of wet pine and the faint tang of the ocean we'd left behind. Ghost padded ahead, ears perked, tail high. I had my phone for pictures and offline GPS, plus a paper map I'd printed before I left Seattle. At first everything matched up. I traced my route, marking small ponds and streams, feeling proud of my new wilderness skills. By sunset, I found a decent clearing to set up camp. I pitched a small 2-person tent, gave Ghost his kibble, and warmed a can of chili on my little camping stove. The night was peaceful until about 3 a.m. I woke to Ghost snarling. The hair on his neck stood on end, and he was staring past the tent wall as if he could see right through it. I lay there, heart pounding, and listened. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no insects, just a thick hush that made my ears buzz. My breath felt too loud in the small space. Eventually, Ghost settled, though he remained tense. I tried to peer through a gap in the tent flap with my flashlight, but all I saw was the swirl of fog hugging the ground. I decided it was probably a deer, or maybe a bear wandering by. But it took me an hour to fall back asleep. The next morning, I unzipped my tent to find the weather had turned. A heavy fog hung in the trees, as if it had rolled in specifically to drench the forest in gloom. Fine droplets clung to my eyelashes. My phone battery was already lower than it should have been. It had been fully charged the day before, but it read 42%. And that wasn't the only oddity. My watch said 6 a.m., but the sun seemed high enough in the sky that it felt more like mid-morning. I shrugged it off. Maybe I was disoriented from a bad night's sleep. As we continued hiking, the fog seemed to follow us, or else we wandered in circles. My GPS signal kept flickering, but that didn't surprise me too much. We were in the middle of nowhere. Then it started marking my location as if I was drifting off the map. The phone's compass spun randomly. I turned to my printed map for guidance. The landmarks looked different. The trail seemed to veer in a direction that didn't match where I stood. A drizzle began, making it hard to keep the paper map dry. By afternoon, I was certain I had strayed off course. I was frustrated but not panicked. I had 5 more days before I needed to be back at the pickup point. Getting lost was part of the adventure, right? Still, I made note of my surroundings and pushed on in what I believed was a northerly direction, away from the coast. The forest thickened. Dead branches scraped my arms, and the ground became mucky, dotted with pockets of standing water. Ghost stayed close, occasionally whining at something I couldn't see. By the time I found a suitable place to camp, I was exhausted. My phone was down to 15%. That was faster battery drain than I'd ever experienced. I laid out dinner. Ghost ate eagerly, but I found I had no appetite. The vibe of the place weighed on me. It was then that I noticed my leftover chili from the night before, still sealed in a plastic container, had grown a layer of black mold. 24 hours shouldn't be enough for mold to appear. The entire container stank of rot. Even more bizarre, a couple of my protein bars and unopened wrappers had turned mushy, like they'd been submerged in water for weeks. I felt my throat tighten. This was no normal spoilage. I tried to light a small fire using a portable butane lighter. The wood was damp, so it took some patience. Finally, a flame took, though it flickered a strange greenish hue. For a moment, I thought it was a chemical reaction from wet wood. But it shifted from green to blue, and then into a dim blackish ember that barely gave off any light. Ghost whined the whole time, stepping away from the flames. That night, I woke up again, though this time to silence and an odd sense that someone was outside. I inched up and flicked on my flashlight. Ghost was standing at the tent door, hackles raised. I listened, but couldn't hear footsteps. Then I heard a faint dragging sound, like cloth scraping against the forest floor. Heart pounding, I unzipped the tent and aimed my light in the direction of the noise. The beam cut through swirling fog, revealing nothing but a few twisted tree trunks. Yet I could have sworn I saw movement, a flicker of something shifting among the branches. I was too scared to call out. My flashlight began to flicker, so I quickly ducked back inside, zipping up tight. Come morning, I discovered something else. My sleeping bag was partially unzipped from the inside. I had gone to bed fully zipped, and I usually toss a bit, but not enough to open it all the way. Outside, the fire pit was cold, though the embers should have held heat. My backpack lay half buried in mud, as if someone had tried to drag it off. I checked it, expecting to find my supplies rummaged or stolen, but everything was still there, just wet and caked in foul-smelling earth. It stank of sulfur, the kind of smell you get near hot springs or rotten eggs. Some primal fear began growing in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a small animal had nosed around, trying to get my food. Yet it didn't explain the smell, or the weird unzipping, or the dragging. I told myself to stay focused. If I started panicking, I'd make stupid decisions. I needed to find a better route, or at least some high ground to orient myself. So I packed up, gave Ghost a reassuring pat, and forced myself to continue deeper into the woods. By midday, the fog thickened to a suffocating blanket. I couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Ghost became skittish, tail between his legs, constantly glancing behind us. My phone died entirely, despite being on 10% earlier in the morning. My watch kept resetting to midnight. Every time I glanced at it, the digital numbers blinked 12 o'clock. I tried not to think about how bizarre it all was. The harder I walked, the more lost I felt, though I was somehow sure I was traveling in a straight line. Then I saw him. He emerged from the mist in front of me. A tall man wearing what looked like a thin hiking jacket and cargo pants. His clothes were clean, bone dry, not at all what you'd expect in this damp environment. He wore no backpack that I could see. He came up the trail so silently that Ghost didn't even bark at first. It was only when the man smiled that Ghost began to growl. "Hi there," the man said. His voice echoed strangely in the fog, too sharp, like someone talking through a hollow pipe. "Oh, hey," I stammered, trying to calm Ghost with a hand on his back. "Didn't think I'd run into anyone out here." The man's smile was wide, unnervingly so. "I'm lost," he said. "I've been wandering for days. Mind if I stick with you?" My gut churned. Everything about him felt off. His eyes were too bright, or maybe just too steady. It was the unblinking gaze you get from mannequins. But I couldn't just turn him away. I wasn't raised to be rude, and I was eager for some human company, even if it felt wrong. "Sure," I said. "I'm Ethan. This is Ghost." He lowered his eyes to Ghost, who was baring his teeth. "David," he replied simply. Then he turned that unsettling smile on me again. "Nice dog." I tried to force a laugh, but it came out as a strained cough. He's usually friendly. That was a lie. Ghost was typically friendly. His reaction to David was brand new. David didn't seem to notice, or care, that Ghost was on edge. We walked, or I walked, and David accompanied me. But within an hour I realized David wasn't carrying any gear, not even a water bottle. He had no backpack, no canteen, nothing. When I offered him some of my water, he just shook his head. "Don't need it," he said, with that same disarming grin. My nerves jangled like an alarm. The man was obviously not okay in the head, or worse, he was messing with me. But in that lonely wilderness, the idea of ditching him seemed even more dangerous. What if he followed me anyway? So I did my best to keep some distance. Ghost refused to walk next to him. He hung back, lip curled. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I found a spot under a large tree where the ground was relatively dry and decided to set up camp. David said nothing as I busied myself pitching the tent. He just stood nearby, smiling. Occasionally, he would vanish into the fog for minutes at a time, only to appear behind me without a sound. Each time, my stomach clenched like I was in free fall. When dinner time came, I heated a small portion of rice and tuna. David sat on a fallen log. He didn't ask for food, nor did he seem to want any. He just watched me eat with that persistent grin. I tried to make small talk, but he answered only in vague sentences. "Where did you hike in from?" I asked. "Over there," he replied, gesturing with a tilt of his head to the tree line. The gesture didn't point to any clear direction. "How long have you been out here?" He blinked at that, or half blinked. His eyelids fluttered. "Time can be a tricky thing," he said. A chill ran down my spine. An animal rustled in the brush, and Ghost jerked his head up, letting out a low growl. David just stared at Ghost, unblinking. Sleep that night was impossible. I lay in my tent with Ghost by my side, listening to the drip of condensation. David had said he would keep watch, but I had no idea where he'd gone. Every noise outside the tent made me flinch. My heart hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears. After several hours, I felt myself slip into a half-sleep, only to be startled awake by the unmistakable sensation that someone was kneeling next to me. I opened my eyes. David was crouched right outside my tent screen, smiling in at me. His face was inches away from the mesh. "You can't leave," he whispered. "Not yet." I gasped and tried to scramble away, my hands clumsy. Ghost lunged toward the screen, barking like mad. In one fluid motion, David stood and vanished into the swirling fog. My chest heaved as I tried to calm down. Ghost was trembling too, hackles raised. We spent the rest of the night in that adrenaline-soaked state. I think I dozed off just before dawn, only to awaken to a horrifying sight. My entire cooler of supplies was rotted. The bread had turned black. The jerky was covered in some slimy white fungus, and even the unopened canned goods had rusted in a matter of hours. It made no sense. The food I'd eaten the night before was fine, so this had to have happened overnight. More disturbing was the fact that my sleeping bag was unzipped yet again. Worse still, Ghost's sleeping pad was gone, replaced with a bundle of wet leaves that smelled like sulfur. It was as if someone had removed his pad while we slept, but I never heard a sound. Rising, I stumbled out of the tent. David was nowhere to be seen. My stomach twisted with nausea at the rotted supplies. With no phone, no working watch, and possibly no more good food, I realized I needed to head back to the coast, pronto. We might still have a chance to catch the boat if we retraced our steps. But the trail looked unfamiliar in the morning light. Even the large tree we had camped under seemed different, gnarled in ways I didn't remember, with bark patterns like leering faces. I tried calling out, "David?" in a half-hearted attempt, not sure if I wanted him to respond or not. The forest swallowed my voice. No answer. Relieved and unnerved at the same time, I gathered what supplies were salvageable, fed Ghost what remained of the kibble, thankfully it hadn't spoiled, and we set off. The fog clung to the underbrush, swirling around my ankles. Every now and then I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, it was only Ghost. I moved as quickly as I could, stumbling over roots, pushing through thick tangles of branches. Some part of me thought I could outpace whatever was happening here. If I could just make it to the shore, maybe the boat captain would come early, or a passing fisherman would see me. I don't know how long we walked. My sense of time was warped. Ghost let out an occasional whimper, and I realized I had no clue how many hours had passed since dawn. The sky stayed the same dull gray as though the sun refused to climb. My stomach growled, but I was hesitant to eat any more of the rotting rations. I felt dehydrated, dizzy. Then Ghost disappeared. One moment, he was padding beside me. Next, a swirl of fog drifted between us, and when it cleared, he was gone. My heart lurched. I shouted his name until my voice cracked. I thrashed through the brush, searching. Nothing. The thick silence pressed in again, except for a faint laugh. David's laugh, or so I thought, echoing in the distance. Or maybe it was just the wind in the branches. I wasn't sure, and I was alone. Panic and sorrow punched me in the gut. Ghost had been with me through so much, and now, in the middle of nowhere, he'd vanished. For a moment, I considered collapsing in despair, but I forced myself to move. I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I told myself Ghost was strong. He could handle himself. And maybe I'd find him up ahead. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. My legs ached. My head pounded with dehydration. Eventually, I broke through the tree line into a small clearing dotted with large boulders and patches of bright green moss. The fog was slightly thinner here, enough for me to see maybe 30 or 40 yards. In the center of the clearing stood David, and beside him, unbelievably, was Ghost. But something was off. Ghost was sitting motionless, staring into the distance. David had a hand resting on my dog's head almost affectionately. My blood went cold. I approached cautiously. "Ghost!" I called, voice trembling. My dog didn't move. David turned his head slowly, that eerie smile plastered on his face. "You looking for him?" he asked. "He's fine. Just needed a little rest." I took another hesitant step. "Ghost, come on, buddy. Let's go." Ghost didn't respond at all. He remained sitting like a statue, eyes unfocused. Slowly, David removed his hand from Ghost's head and spread his arms wide. "You can take him," he said softly, stepping back. "He's all yours." I rushed forward, ignoring David's presence, dropping to my knees beside Ghost. I patted his sides, running my hands through his fur. He was cold, so cold. My heart hammered. I lifted his muzzle to meet his eyes, and that's when I noticed he wasn't blinking. It was like his eyes were glass. His chest wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. Terror seized me. "What did you do to him?" I shouted at David. But David just tilted his head, lips curled in that perpetual grin. "You wanted your dog back," he said simply. My instincts screamed. I tried to pick Ghost up, but his weight felt wrong. Too heavy, as though something inside him had turned to stone. Panic sparked, and I glanced around, desperate for any explanation. Then I saw a patch of fur on Ghost's side that was still wet with blood. A large, raw wound near his rib cage, partially hidden by the thick coat. I realized with dawning horror that this might not be Ghost at all. Or if it was, he was dead. That was enough to break me. I let go, stumbling backward. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like jelly. David strode closer, looming over me. Up close, his skin looked almost translucent, revealing black veins beneath. His eyes shone with an unnatural light, and his grin never wavered. "Thank you for letting me accompany you," he said in a tone that mocked politeness. "I get lonely out here." He reached out as if to place his hand on my shoulder. Fear fueled me, and I scrambled to my feet, backing away so fast I tripped over a rock and fell. My palms tore open on gravel. David continued to approach, a slow, measured pace, while the statue-still form of Ghost, or whatever wore Ghost's appearance, remained behind. I fumbled for the hunting knife strapped to my belt. With shaking hands, I brandished it. "Stay back," I croaked. David paused. His grin remained, but now his eyes narrowed. "What are you going to do with that?" he asked, as if genuinely curious. I'll kill you," I stammered, though I had no confidence I could harm him at all. His mouth opened, letting out a silent laugh, and then he lunged, startlingly fast. He didn't run so much as glide across the ground. I slashed wildly. I'm not even sure I connected, but I must have, because David recoiled with a raspy hiss. A jagged tear opened across his shirt, and behind it, I glimpsed something writhing beneath his skin, like shadows dancing just beneath translucent flesh. I used that moment of recoil to bolt back into the trees, leaving behind that clearing where my dog's lifeless form sat like a puppet. Branches whipped my face. My breath came in ragged gasps. In that adrenaline-fueled frenzy, I ran until spots clouded my vision. Eventually, the forest floor sloped downward, and I tumbled into a small ravine, landing hard on my side. Pain flared through my ribs, leaving me wheezing. For a while I lay there, only the steady drip of water from mossy ledges overhead breaking the silence. Every muscle ached. I pressed a hand to my side, feeling for broken bones. I thought maybe I'd cracked a rib, but the pain wasn't excruciating enough to confirm that. My palms were scraped raw, blood mixing with mud. When I finally gathered the strength to stand, I realized the world around me had grown darker. I assumed it was evening, but my watch, useless as it was, still blinked 12 o'clock. I tried to gauge time by the sky, but it remained a uniform gray. Maybe it was still late afternoon, or maybe it was midnight, or maybe time had stopped working altogether in this place. My sense of reality felt shaken to the core. I forced myself to walk. My steps were unsteady, but fear drove me forward. I was alone, nearly out of food, with no functional phone or GPS, and a possibly supernatural creature on my trail. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Light, purposeful footsteps that ceased the moment I paused. Once, I glanced over my shoulder and saw a flash of movement among the trees. I didn't wait to investigate. My plan, if you could call it that, was to make it back to the coast. From there, I'd try to signal a passing boat or simply wait for my scheduled pickup. Even if that was days away, it was better than staying in the thick of the forest. I used small streams to guide me, following the flow of water in the general direction of the ocean. My stomach rumbled emptily, but I dared not open any more rotted supplies. Once or twice, I tried to drink from the streams, hoping the water was safe. It tasted of minerals and silt, but at least it was wet. Hours, or possibly a day, went by. My body felt ready to collapse. Finally, I recognized a large boulder near a shallow creek that I was sure I had passed on the first day. I almost cried with relief. I was finding my way back, or so I thought. That's when I heard a rustle and a low whining sound behind a clump of bushes. I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. Part of me screamed not to check, terrified I'd find David or that horrifying imitation of ghost. But I had to see. Slowly, I crept forward, knife in hand, and parted the bushes. Ghost lay there, the real Ghost, with bright red blood staining his fur. He was badly wounded. A gash ran across his flank, and his breathing was shallow but present. He blinked weakly when he saw me. Relief and heartbreak warred in my chest. I dropped to my knees, tears streaming as I pressed my hands against the wound to stop the bleeding. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if it would be. "I'm here." He let out a small whimper, licking my hand. My mind raced. I needed to treat him, but my medical kit was limited to some bandages and antiseptic cream. I did my best, carefully cleaning and wrapping the wound with trembling hands. Ghost winced, but didn't resist. I whispered comforting words, trying to keep from breaking down. He was alive. That alone felt like a miracle. Then a voice drifted from behind me. "I told you, time is tricky here." I spun. David stood at the edge of the bushes, face contorted in mock sympathy. He looked different. Half of his jaw hung slack, as though something had torn at it, exposing blackish muscle. Yet he smiled still. A flicker of black smoke seeped from the corner of his mouth, dissipating quickly in the damp air. "You're a monster," I snarled. He tilted his head. "Monster? That's an interesting word. I've never liked it." My pulse thundered. I crouched protectively over Ghost, brandishing the knife again. David took a step closer, his movements twitchy now, less fluid, as if he were struggling to keep his body in one piece. "Give me the dog," he said, his voice sounding doubled, an echo of itself. "No," I growled. David smiled that unnerving smile again, then lunged. I braced for the impact, thinking I'd surely lose. But Ghost, injured as he was, found the strength to leap up and snap at David's leg, teeth clamping with desperate fury. David howled, an unearthly shriek that made my skull vibrate. I took the opening, gripping my hunting knife in both hands, and slashed upward. The blade caught David under the jaw, ripping through the pale flesh. A hiss of black vapor burst out, like I'd struck a pressurized tank of smoke. He stumbled back, clawing at his face. Something in me snapped. I stabbed again, aiming for his chest, expecting to feel bone or muscle. Instead, it felt like stabbing through wet paper. His body seemed hollow, swirling with that blackness. David reeled, screeching, the black smoke pouring from his wounds. His eyes glowed white-hot for an instant, wide with shock or fury. Then he collapsed to his knees, still silent, laughing with that horrible grin. I grabbed Ghost under the torso and scrambled away, putting as much distance between us and David as I could. A few dozen yards away, I paused behind a thick trunk to glance back. David lay sprawled on the ground, his body peeling like burnt paper. The edges of him curled upward, dissolving into the swirling fog. Even then, I could see the faint silhouette of that grin in the black haze. A final shape of his face lingered before vanishing into nothing. Shaking, I clung to Ghost. Every nerve in my body wanted to sprint, but Ghost needed me to move carefully. He whined, and I stroked his head, whispering comforts, while inside relief and terror wrestled. Had I really killed him? Or it? I had no idea, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out if he could come back. I forced myself to keep going, following the creek downstream, half carrying Ghost. Despite his injuries, he tried to support himself, staggering on 3 legs. The gash on his flank seeped blood, and I had to frequently stop and reapply pressure. It felt like an eternity, but eventually, we emerged onto a stony shoreline. Beyond the rolling bank of gravel lay the water, gray and choppy under the same oppressive sky. The tide was out, revealing a wide expanse of wet, glistening stones and seaweed. No boats, no sign of humanity, just emptiness. I scanned the horizon, throat tight, praying to see a speck that might be Gordon or another fishing vessel. Nothing. My watch still blinked 12 o'clock. For a second, I worried that maybe I'd arrived too late or too soon, or that time no longer worked for me. Ghost whimpered, collapsing onto the damp gravel, panting heavily. I knelt beside him, exhausted, trying to figure out what to do next. A scream shattered the silence. I froze, adrenaline flaring. But the scream wasn't behind me. It was inside my own mind, echoing. Images of David's disintegrating body flashed before my eyes. Then I heard a distant sound like the rumble of an engine. My heart soared. It might be a boat. Summoning whatever energy I had left, I scooped Ghost into my arms, ignoring the searing pain in my shoulders, and stumbled along the shoreline, searching for the source of that blessed sound. The fog parted just enough for me to see a small fishing boat idling maybe a quarter-mile out. I waved frantically, screaming hoarsely. At first, I got no reaction. Then, someone on the deck waved back. I sloshed into the frigid water, up to my thighs, nearly losing my footing on the slick rocks. Waves crashed against me, threatening to tear Ghost from my arms. I kept shouting, "Help! Over here!" After a tense few minutes, the boat turned and slowly made its way in my direction, navigating carefully around rocks and shallows. As it drew closer, I recognized the captain, Gordon, the same grizzled man who had dropped me off. He looked stunned to see me. When the boat was close enough, he shouted, "What the hell happened to you?" I didn't have the energy to answer. He tossed a rope ladder over the side, and I somehow climbed aboard with Ghost in tow. My dog let out a weak cry as a deckhand tried to assist. Gordon's eyes scanned my torn clothing, my battered body, and Ghost's bloody flank. He muttered something under his breath, cursing in disbelief. Inside the small cabin, I collapsed onto a bench, hugging Ghost, who whimpered softly. Gordon brought blankets and a first aid kit. "We weren't supposed to pick you up for another 2 days, he said, confusion etched on his face. "What happened?" "Got lost, rotted food, something in the fog," I managed between ragged breaths. I stabbed it, but my dog." A wave of nausea hit me, and I bent over, retching nothing but bile. Gordon exchanged worried glances with his deckhand, then gently clapped me on the shoulder. "We'll get you back. Don't worry," he said. It took hours to reach Ketchikan. The entire trip I was in a haze, barely coherent. Ghost lay beside me, each breath rattling. When we finally docked, Gordon insisted on taking us straight to a vet, and then to a small clinic for me. The vet was astonished Ghost was still alive with such a deep wound. They rushed him into surgery. Meanwhile, I got patched up at the clinic. My hands were bandaged, a few cracked ribs taped, and I received fluids for severe dehydration. The doctor scolded me for being so reckless, though even I couldn't begin to explain the true nature of what had happened. What rattled me most, though, was the reaction of the locals. When I told them I'd been out there for roughly 4 or 5 days, they said I'd been missing for over a month. Gordon swore he'd waited the scheduled week, then an additional 4 days, searching the coastline for any sign of me before giving up. According to him, I'd been gone for a total of 33 days. My mind reeled at the timeline, unable to reconcile it with my lived experience. The nightmares started immediately. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw David's grin, or the twisted shape of Ghost's body in that clearing. The clinic staff recommended I stay a few extra nights for observation, suspecting trauma and possible hallucinations from exposure. But I declined. I just wanted to get Ghost and get the hell out of Alaska. Once Ghost was stable enough, I arranged for a flight back to Seattle. The entire ordeal felt like a dream, or a story I'd read about someone else. But something lingered. On the plane ride home, Ghost lay sedated in a pet carrier in the cargo hold, and I sat by the window staring at my reflection in the plexiglass. My reflection stared back, of course, but there was something off about it. My face seemed older, drawn. My eyes looked sunken, and the corners of my mouth twitched into a fleeting grin I didn't remember making. When I got back to my apartment in Seattle, I expected comfort, but everything felt foreign. I jumped at every sound, half expecting David to appear in the doorway. Ghost recovered slowly. The vet said it was a miracle he pulled through. He limped around with a bandage on his flank for weeks, giving me sad eyes that asked how we could make sense of any of it. As the weeks passed, life returned to a semblance of normal. I tried to bury myself in work. Ghost regained some of his old energy, though he never quite wagged his tail the same way. Sometimes, late at night, I'd find him staring at the corner of the living room, growling low, as if he saw something I couldn't. I began avoiding mirrors, especially at night, because there were moments when I'd catch my reflection wearing that grin. I'd quickly look away, my heart hammering. In that split second, it wasn't me. Some nights, I woke to the sound of zippers, like a sleeping bag being slowly undone. But when I sat up in bed, panting in the darkness, my comforter was in place, the room empty. On another occasion, I found rotted food in my refrigerator, though I'd only bought it a day earlier. The stench of sulfur sometimes wafted through my apartment, though I couldn't find the source. I wondered if I'd brought back more than just physical scars from Foggy Bay, if something had followed, or if a piece of that place now lived inside me. Then, about a month after I'd returned, I had the worst nightmare yet. I saw myself back in that clearing, kneeling beside Ghost's motionless form. David stood behind me, smiling, only this time he wore my face. His jaw unhinged, stretching wider than humanly possible, and the black smoke poured out, swallowing us both. I woke in a cold sweat, trembling so violently my teeth chattered. Ghost lay at the foot of my bed, wide awake, staring at me with an almost human concern in his eyes. At that moment, I realized that no matter how many miles separated me from the Alaskan wilderness, I'd never truly escape the memory of what I encountered. The horror might fade in time, but I sensed it wasn't gone, just dormant, waiting. And so here I am, writing this all down. I've tried to keep it as realistic as possible, though some events defy explanation. I know how it sounds, insane, impossible, but I can't change what I experienced. I can't change the fact that David existed, or that time folded in on itself. I can't change that Ghost was torn apart and somehow returned, or that I stabbed a creature made of black smoke and empty flesh. Worst of all, I can't shake the feeling that a part of that creature is still with me, in me, the reflection in the mirror that smiles when I'm not smiling. I'd like to say this story has a resolution, that we're safe now, that I found closure. But the truth is, I haven't. Sometimes I wake up in the dead of night thinking I hear David's voice whisper, "You can't leave." Other times, I swear the clock in my kitchen resets to 12 o'clock, blinking ominously. And in those moments, I wonder if I really did make it back at all, or if I'm still wandering in the fog, trapped in some twisted version of reality. I doubt I'll ever step foot in Alaska again. Maybe that's wise. Maybe it's cowardly. But if you ever find yourself in Foggy Bay, remember this. If you see a man wandering the woods without supplies, smiling too wide, turn around. Walk away. Because some trails are meant to stay lost, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be shut. My name is Alex Foster. I'm 32 years old, and this happened in March of 2022. I remember the exact month and year because it was right at the tail end of winter, just as the Alaskan thaw was starting to show itself in tiny streams trickling under the ice. Back then, I was trying to escape a life that felt meaningless after losing the person I loved most. The wilderness seemed like a place where I could escape all the noise in my head and learn to live on my own terms. I moved out to a small cabin near Lake Clark National Park. I'd been there for only 6 months, but in that short time, I'd already discovered that I wasn't half as prepared as I'd thought. The weather was more brutal than I ever imagined, and simple tasks like chopping wood or hauling water required more stamina than my old desk job had ever demanded. Still, I kept at it, eager to prove to myself that I could do it. I wasn't entirely alone. I had my Alaskan Malamute, Kodiak, who was my constant companion. He was big, strong, and incredibly loyal. He'd follow me everywhere, whether I was gathering wood or setting out on a hunt, though I will admit I wasn't much of a hunter yet. More often, I relied on what little supplies I'd stockpiled or occasionally bartered with a neighbor who lived a few miles away, through the dense forest. That neighbor was Danny Rhodes. He was 36, and from what I understood, he had been living off the grid for about 5 years. He seemed to know a lot more about survival than I did. I'd met him a few times while hiking the nearby trails. He had a knack for making me feel both comfortable and slightly uneasy, like he was nice enough but always holding something back, never letting me see the full picture of who he was. I'm not sure when exactly the strangeness began. It might have been the day I looked across the lake and thought I saw my own reflection standing on the far shore. It might have started earlier with smaller things that I brushed off as my own mistakes or a product of Alaska's harsh environment. But if I had to pinpoint a single moment that told me something was truly wrong, it was a Sunday afternoon in mid-March. The day started innocently enough. I got up before sunrise, tossed a few logs into the wood stove, and heated water for coffee. Kodiak was pacing around the cabin, snuffling at the door. He needed his morning walk, so I geared up in my heavy coat and we both stepped outside. The air was crisp, cold enough to sting my cheeks, and the sky was streaked with pink and gold from the rising sun. My cabin was set about 50 yards from the shore of Lake Clark, with a decent view of the water through the thin belt of pines. I liked to watch the light play on the ice, especially during sunrise. But as I headed toward the lake, I noticed Kodiak had stiffened. His ears were pinned back, and he was growling low in his throat. I followed his gaze. On the opposite bank, maybe 100 yards away, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was just me, my own reflection. But that made no sense. It wasn't water so smooth that I could see myself that clearly, and certainly not upright. Then I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, or some fisherman or hiker, but no one else came out here this time of year without reason. The figure was about my height, wearing similar winter gear. I couldn't see the face clearly, but I felt a sensation like vertigo, as though the world had tilted. Because the stance, the tilt of the head, everything about it looked exactly like me. I tried to wave, but the figure didn't wave back. It took a step backward, disappearing behind a cluster of frozen pine trees. Kodiak let out a bark that echoed across the ice. The hair on the back of my neck bristled, and I felt an unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan cold. I told myself it was just another hiker, possibly even Danny playing a prank. Though in my gut, I knew something about it wasn't right. When I got back to the cabin, I was still trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I decided to consult my map to see if there were any known trails across the lake that might bring people through that area. It should have been a simple check. I'd pored over that map so many times I practically had it memorized. But the moment I spread it out on my small kitchen table, I froze. The lines of the trails and contours of the land around Lake Clark seemed off. Some of the topography was out of place, and one creek I knew existed from my hikes wasn't marked at all. Another path that had previously been a dotted line meandering near my cabin had shifted to an entirely different area. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was looking at an older map, or that I'd gotten them mixed up. But there was only one map. It was my main reference, a 1. 63,360 scale that I had pinned to the wall for months. I traced my finger over the lake's perimeter, over the location where I'd built my cabin. The outline was close to correct, but the shape was slightly wrong, as if a child had traced it from memory. My head started to pound. Maybe my memory was playing tricks on me, or maybe I was more exhausted than I realized. I set the map aside, deciding to do some chores and come back to it later. That evening, I tried lighting a fire in the old stone pit just outside my cabin. I had some fresh kindling and a pile of dry logs I'd split the day before. The flame caught quickly, but after a minute, the color of the flame shifted. It turned blue, then green, dancing across the logs with an eerie vibrancy. I backed away, concerned that maybe I'd dripped some chemical on the wood. But I couldn't figure out what chemical it might be. As if that wasn't enough, the flame seemed to sputter in a peculiar way, like it was inhaling and exhaling. Then, with a hiss that almost sounded like a gasp, the entire fire snuffed out in a flash of pale light. Kodiak stood at my side, hackles raised, whining low in his throat. I tried relighting the fire 3 times. Each time, it sputtered, changed color, and died. Eventually, I gave up, letting darkness take over. I trudged inside, feeling unease creep into every corner of my mind. 2 days later, I decided to pay Danny a visit. He lived about 2 miles north through thick forest. Usually, the walk would take me about 40 minutes, but my sense of time was starting to feel unreliable. I noticed that the sun seemed to be setting faster than usual, and when I checked my watch, it contradicted the twilight in the sky. I remember leaving around noon. By the time I got to Danny's cabin, the sky was already turning orange and pink, like the sun was about to set, but my watch showed only 1:15 p.m. I knocked on Danny's door. No answer. It was weird for him to be out, given how cold it still was, but I figured he might be out hunting or gathering. I circled around his property, calling his name, No sign of him anywhere. His cabin was locked up tight, and a quick glance through the window revealed nothing unusual. No sign of a struggle or disarray. Everything looked as I remembered, except for one detail: the big wall calendar he used to keep near the window. It was pinned crooked, half the pages torn off, exposing months that hadn't come yet. It was turned to September, but this was March. That was enough to set my nerves on edge. With Danny missing and strange things happening around my own cabin, I decided I'd have to handle this alone. Back at my place, I tried to radio for help. Well, not so much for help, but to at least check in with the local ranger station. To my frustration, the signal was all static. My phone, which I kept mostly turned off to save battery and only turned on for emergencies, refused to power up at all. It wasn't the battery. It had been fully charged from my small solar setup a week prior. The phone just showed a black screen. Kodiak's behavior started to change as well. He'd pace back and forth at the front door, whining and occasionally letting out low, warning growls at nothing. One morning, I woke up and found him standing in the corner of the cabin, staring at the wall with hackles raised. It was like he sensed someone or something on the other side, but when I opened the door, no one was there. Things got worse. The night after I tried contacting the rangers, I noticed a flicker of movement outside my window. Through the glass, I could see the silhouette of someone standing just beyond the nearest pine tree. I was about to rush out with my rifle when I realized the figure looked exactly like me. Same height, same broad shoulders. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. The shape took a step forward so that the moonlight illuminated part of its face, and I swear for a second I saw my own eyes looking back at me. It wore a mocking grin, lips parted as if it found the entire situation entertaining. I threw the door open, brandishing my rifle, but the figure was gone. There were footprints in the snow leading into the forest, but they didn't trail off to anywhere. They just stopped, as though the figure had vanished into thin air. Inside, Kodiak was growling, fur bristling. I tried to calm him, but I was shaking too badly myself. I slid the bolt on the door, secured the shutters, and spent the rest of the night huddled in my bunk, rifle across my lap. Sometime after midnight, I heard banging on the door. A voice called out, "Alex, you in there?" It sounded like Danny. My initial suspicion told me to ignore it, to stay quiet. But if it really was Danny, I needed answers. I moved slowly to the door, rifle at the ready. "Danny," I called. "That you?" "Yeah, man, it's me," came the reply. "Open up, I'm freezing." Against my better judgment, I unbolted the door and opened it a crack. Sure enough, Danny stood there, hunched over in the cold, his breath coming out in rapid puffs. He looked disheveled, like he'd been wandering for days. I let him in, and the warmth of the cabin seemed to calm him a bit. I noticed something off about him right away. His eyes looked sunken, and his smile clung to his face too long when I greeted him. He asked me for water in this strangely polite tone that barely sounded like him. "Where have you been?" I asked, handing him a cup. His gaze flickered around the cabin before he answered. "Out. Had to gather some things." "For 4 days?" He nodded absently. I lost track of time. You know how it gets. I did know how it got in the wilderness, especially with these weird anomalies, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. I pressed him for more details, but he just gave me these odd, vague responses. I was hunting, then the sun set, but it rose again too soon. That kind of thing. Kodiak, meanwhile, refused to go near Danny. My dog sat in the far corner, watching him with a suspicious glare. Normally, Kodiak was friendly with Danny, even if he was a bit guarded around others. But this time, the dog's entire posture screamed discomfort. "Is something wrong with your dog?" Danny asked, in a voice that had this strange resonance to it, like he was talking through a crack in a wall. "Shouldn't be," I said. "He's usually good with you." Danny just nodded, sipping water. That too wide smile never left his face. Eventually, I offered him a spot to sleep, just a makeshift bed on the floor because my cabin was small. He lay down without a word, turned onto his side and stared at the wall. His breathing was a steady, quiet rhythm. I didn't sleep well that night. I drifted off in fits, rifle close at hand. At one point, I woke up to see Danny standing by the window, looking out into the darkness. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his silhouette edged by the faint glow of the moon. I called his name and he turned around slowly. In the darkness, his eyes had a reflective shine, almost like an animal's caught in headlights. He shuffled back to his makeshift bed and lay down. I convinced myself I'd imagined that glow in his eyes, that it was just the angle of the moonlight. In the morning, something even more unsettling happened. I stepped outside with Kodiak to get some fresh air. The sky was a dull gray, and a light snow was falling. Everything looked normal for the moment. But when I came back inside, Danny was gone. The door wasn't open, and the windows were still latched from the inside. It was as though he'd evaporated. My confusion grew when I found footprints leading from the center of the cabin's floor to the front door, but they faded halfway across the floorboards. There was no sign that the door had been unlatched. Even the bolt was still in place. I called out his name, and of course there was no answer. I was torn between relief and dread. Part of me was glad this strange version of Danny was gone, but another part of me worried about what that meant for me. Over the next 2 days, I experienced some of the worst fear of my life. It started when I woke up to find my supplies in a state of rot. The canned goods were rusted over, as though years had passed in a single night. My dried jerky had gone green with mold, and even the water in my jug had a stale odor. It all smelled foul, like decomposition in fast forward. I also discovered my backpack was missing. I'd left it by the cabin door. It wasn't outside, and it wasn't inside. I tore the place apart looking for it, but it was gone, along with most of my survival gear and extra clothing. I had no clue who or what could have taken it. Worse yet, Kodiak became increasingly distressed. He refused to leave my side, but also refused to go near the fireplace. One evening, I managed to get a small fire going in the stove to cook a meager meal of leftover rice. The flames danced with that eerie greenish tinge again, and I swear, just as I stoked the embers, I heard a faint whisper in the crackling. It almost sounded like my own voice, echoing back at me from inside the fire. On the 4th day after Danny's strange disappearance, or reappearance, depending on how you viewed it, I woke up to the absolute worst sight imaginable. Kodiak was gone. Panic surged through me. I'd locked the cabin, latched the shutters. There was no way he could have slipped out without me noticing. I grabbed my coat, threw open the door, and started calling for him. My voice echoed through the cold morning air. No bark, no responding howl. Frantic, I combed the immediate surroundings, yelling his name. Tracks in the snow led around the side of the cabin, and I followed them, heart hammering. And that's when I found him, or what was left of him. It looked like Kodiak had been ripped open from sternum to tail. Chunks of fur and flesh lay scattered in the blood-stained snow. The shock of it nearly knocked me off my feet. My vision tunneled, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. My best friend, my loyal companion, was gone. Tears froze on my cheeks as I crouched there, choking on my own breath. I'd never seen anything so violent, so utterly horrifying. No animal I knew of, not even a grizzly, would kill in such a vicious manner without dragging the carcass off. And the strangest part? There were no tracks leading away from Kodiak's body, only the dog's own prints leading to that spot. It was as if he'd been torn apart by something invisible, or by something that dropped from the sky, or something that never bothered to leave tracks at all. I don't remember how long I knelt there, staring at the gore. Eventually, I staggered back to my cabin, tears and panic mixing into a maelstrom of horror in my head. I barely had the presence of mind to block the door behind me. Sometime that afternoon, if it even was afternoon, my sense of time was now hopelessly scrambled. I heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside. My first instinct was fear, but then I recalled that weird figure, the one that wore my face, and a wave of fury washed over me. I was done being scared. It had taken my dog, my only friend out here, and I was determined to make it pay. I grabbed my rifle and flung the door open. No one was there. The steps in the snow, however, were fresh. 2 parallel lines of footprints leading toward the forest. They looked like my own boots. I followed them, rifle clutched in my hands, adrenaline fueling each stride. The prints led me straight into the woods, weaving through pine and spruce. The deeper I went, the more the landscape seemed to shift. Trees appeared in places I didn't remember, and the path twisted in ways it never had before. My heart pounded as I realized that the very layout of the forest seemed plastic, malleable. The footprints ended in a small clearing, a circular patch of exposed ground. There, in the center, was Danny, or rather, something wearing Danny's face. He stood with his back to me, shoulders hunched, head tilted at an unnatural angle. I raised the rifle. "Turn around," I said, voice shaky. "Now." Slowly, oh so slowly, he pivoted. His face was exactly as I remembered, but his eyes had this vacant glare, and his mouth was set in that perpetual, too-wide grin. He took one step toward me, and I fired a warning shot into the ground. He paused, looking down at the bullet hole in the soil. The grin on his face faltered for just a second. "Danny?" I asked, though I didn't really believe it was him. He cocked his head, studying me like a curious animal. "Alex," he said in that hollow, disembodied tone, "you shouldn't be here anymore." My breath hitched. "What do you mean?" "It's time for you to leave." "That's exactly what I'm trying to do," I said, gesturing with the rifle. "But I need to know what the hell is going on." He took another step closer. I backed away, nearly tripping over a tree root. He held out a hand, almost as if he wanted me to hand him the rifle. "Don't you see?" he asked. "You never left. You've always been here." My head spun. I tightened my grip on the rifle, finger trembling on the trigger. "Stop moving. Stay where you are." He ignored me, continuing forward. In a panic, I squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, the recoil jarring my shoulder. The bullet struck him in the chest, but I noticed something truly horrific. Black tar began oozing out of the wound, thick and viscous instead of blood. He looked down at it, frowning, then reached a hand to touch the tar. It clung to his fingers, stretching like melted rubber. I pumped another round into the chamber, fighting to steady my breathing. "What are you?" He lifted his gaze, that grin returning, stretching his cheeks unnaturally. "You. I'm you, Alex. And Danny, and Kodiak, and everything else I want to be." Before I could react, he lunged. I fired again, and the bullet took off a chunk of flesh from his shoulder. More tar spattered across the snow. He stumbled, but his momentum drove him right into me. We hit the ground hard, my rifle pinning between our bodies. My breath whooshed out of my lungs as he pressed his face close to mine. I could smell the rot of whatever he was. His eyes glowed with a faint amber light, and he hissed, "Why do you keep fighting?" Rage filled me. Rage at the loss of Kodiak, at the entire nightmare. I managed to get a hand free and slammed the butt of the rifle into his head. He reeled back, giving me a chance to scramble to my feet. Blood roared in my ears as I took aim one last time. I shot him in the leg, half hoping to incapacitate him. He fell to the ground, black tar oozing into the snow. But he still tried to crawl toward me, leaving a slick trail behind him. "Alex," he croaked, "we share the same soul." I spat on the ground, fear turning into cold fury. "You don't have a soul." His grin widened again, and it was the most hideous expression I've ever seen. Then, to my horror, he started to change. His face warped, nose flattening, mouth distorting. He was trying to reshape himself. I backed away, forcing myself to think. I couldn't just leave him there to follow me. I needed to finish this. But how do you kill something that bleeds tar and doesn't seem to feel pain? Then I remembered the cabin. If I could get him inside, I might be able to burn the entire place down with him in it. Steeling myself, I hoisted him up by the collar, ignoring the streaks of tar that clung to my coat. He was heavier than he looked, or maybe I was just exhausted. With the rifle slung over my shoulder, I half dragged, half pushed him through the forest, following what seemed like a newly formed path. Miraculously, I found the route back to my cabin more quickly than I expected, though time itself felt meaningless now. He tried to fight me every step of the way, hissing and sputtering. Once, he even tried to bite my arm, but I bashed him across the face with the rifle stock. That slowed him down. When we finally stumbled into the clearing by my cabin, the sky was a dim twilight. Could have been dawn or dusk. I couldn't tell anymore. I kicked open the door and dragged him inside, dumping him near the stone fireplace. He lay there, moaning in a voice that sometimes sounded like mine, sometimes like Danny's. His body twisted again, bones cracking as though rearranging themselves. Unable to look at the grotesque transformation any longer, I ran outside to the woodpile and gathered every piece of firewood I had. Then I grabbed a can of kerosene from my small shed. Inside, the creature was trying to get up. It had halfway risen to a crouch, but its leg was still mangled from the gunshot wound. I circled around, dousing the walls and floor with kerosene. My heart pounded and sweat trickled into my eyes, stinging them. He let out a slow, raspy laugh. "You think fire will destroy me? We're bound together, Alex." I ignored him, continuing to splash kerosene. "I'm what you see in the mirror when you hate yourself," the creature said, voice scraping like broken glass. "I'm the reflection you can't escape." I lit the match, the small flame dancing at the end of the stick. For a moment, I hesitated, my reflection in the creature's dark, glittering eyes. Then I dropped the match onto the kerosene-soaked floor. A whoosh of flame surged, the heat slamming into me. Smoke curled upward, tinted green around the edges of the flames. The creature screamed, a raw, inhuman wail that rattled my bones. I backed away toward the door, covering my mouth with my forearm. The creature lurched, crawling through the flames, reaching a burning hand toward me. I stumbled outside just as the entire cabin's interior erupted into an inferno of swirling, multicolored fire. Falling onto the snow, I watched flames licking the windows, flickering with that eerie greenish glow. The screaming continued, an agonized shriek that rose to a crescendo, then abruptly cut off, leaving only the crackle and pop of the burning wood. For what felt like hours, I sat there, coughing and gasping in the freezing air. Eventually, the screams subsided. The cabin was a pillar of flame, illuminating the night like a beacon in the wilderness. I must have drifted into a daze or passed out, because the next thing I remember is waking up, shivering at the edge of the clearing. It was broad daylight, the sun glaring off the snow. My cabin was now a smoldering ruin, charred beams collapsing inward. Smoke trailed into the sky, forming a black column against the pale blue. Everything I owned was gone. My shelter, my supplies, my dog, even the few mementos I had from my old life. The only things left were the clothes on my back, my rifle, and a half-empty canteen of water. Numbly, I rose to my feet. If I stayed here, I'd freeze to death or starve. I had no choice but to make my way to the nearest ranger station or outpost, which I knew was miles away. I started walking. I don't remember how long I walked. At some point, the sun set, or maybe it rose. I couldn't tell. The sky seemed stuck in a perpetual twilight, a half-lit gloom that only deepened my sense of unreality. I trudged through thick snow, occasionally stumbling over hidden roots or rocks. My muscles ached, but I kept pushing forward. Eventually, after what felt like days, I came across a small ranger station, a squat wooden building with a radio antenna. Relief flooded me as I banged on the door. A startled ranger opened it. He was a stocky, bearded man who looked at me like I'd just crawled out of a grave. Maybe I had. He ushered me inside, where the warmth of a wood stove greeted me. He offered me a metal chair and a mug of coffee so bitter that it made my eyes water. But it was the sweetest thing I'd ever tasted at that moment. As soon as I could speak, I told him bits and pieces of what had happened, that I'd lost my cabin in a fire, that my dog had been killed by something, that my neighbor, Danny, was missing, or worse. I didn't mention the part about the doppelganger or the black tar. I was sure he'd call the authorities or a mental health professional if I started babbling about that. He was kind. He told me I could rest there while he radioed for help. I tried to stay awake, but the exhaustion overwhelmed me, and I dozed off, leaning against the wall with the half-empty coffee mug still in my hands. When I woke up, the ranger station was quiet, except for the crackling of the radio static. The ranger was nowhere to be seen. My heart leapt to my throat. I stood up, nearly dropping the mug. Had he gone outside, or was something else going on? I peered out the window. His snowmobile was still parked outside. The footprints leading away from the cabin ended just a few feet from the door. A memory flashed. Danny's footprints fading on the cabin floor. My stomach tightened with dread. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No response. Then I noticed the half-open door to a small side room. Tentatively, I stepped inside. It was a storage closet, lined with shelves of emergency provisions. On the floor lay the ranger, dead. His eyes were open, frozen in a look of terror. Black tar smeared across his chest, forming a jagged pattern like a handprint. I stumbled back, nausea churning in my stomach. Was it the same creature that had followed me here? Had it survived the fire? Or was this another manifestation entirely? I rushed out of the closet, grabbing the radio on the main desk, fumbling with the dials. Static hissed. My voice trembled as I tried to call for help. "Mayday, anyone out there? I need immediate assistance at Lake Clark Ranger Station. There's a..." Suddenly, the static cut, replaced by a voice. My own voice. "You were never supposed to leave," it said. I slammed the radio down. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The building felt too small, suffocating. I needed to get out, to run. But where would I go? Frantic, I opened the station door, glancing at the horizon. It was an eerie, colorless sky. The sun, if it was the sun, was a pale disk, neither rising nor setting. My sense of time had vanished again. My breath caught in my throat. Standing on the far edge of the clearing, I saw a silhouette. It was shaped like a man, but so still it might have been a statue. My heart hammered. I knew it was watching me. I lunged for the snowmobile, rummaging through the ranger's pockets for the keys. I found them, jammed them into the ignition and fired it up. The engine roared to life, and with a surge of desperate hope, I sped away from the station, leaving that horrifying scene behind. I don't recall the exact route I took. It's as if my memory is fractured, pieces of it lost to fear and exhaustion. But after hours of winding through the wilderness, I reached the outskirts of a small fishing village near the edge of Lake Clark, a place with a handful of cabins and a dock. I pulled up to the first occupied cabin I saw, hammered on the door, and collapsed onto the porch. When I came to, I was wrapped in a warm blanket, lying on a sofa. A man and woman hovered over me, both in their 50s, lines of worry etched into their faces. They gave me water and insisted I rest. I'm not sure how long I stayed with them, maybe a day, maybe two. During that time, I was too scared to sleep for long. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face, or Danny's face, or my own face, twisted and grinning. Eventually, word got around, and a small group of locals took me to a hospital in Anchorage. The doctors said I was severely dehydrated, suffering from exposure and hallucinations brought on by stress. They asked me about the injuries to my side and arms. I had bruises in the shape of handprints. I didn't know what to tell them. I gave a statement to the state troopers about Danny's disappearance and the ranger's body. They investigated, but apparently found no evidence of a crime at the ranger station. The station was intact, unoccupied, and the ranger was on leave according to their records. The neighbor I claimed was missing, Danny Rhodes, had no official records that matched the description I gave. No one even knew if he existed. As for my cabin, a small search party eventually went out to find it. What they discovered were the charred remains of a structure, though it looked like it had been abandoned for years. They claimed there was no fresh body or signs of a recent fire, only old ashes and collapsed timbers. They said they found no remains of a dog. I was forced to accept that, in the eyes of the authorities, I had either suffered a psychotic break or had some kind of intense trauma-induced hallucination. I didn't press the issue. I'd lost everything. My dog, my home, the few possessions I had left. But I was alive. I tried to rebuild my life in Anchorage, renting a small apartment and getting a job as a clerk at a hardware store. It was a far cry from my old corporate world or my off-grid dreams, but at least it was safe. Still, every so often, I catch my reflection in a window or mirror, and I see something. Sometimes my reflection's eyes don't blink when mine do. Sometimes I catch the corners of my mouth twitching in a grin I'm definitely not making. I wish I could say that's the end of it, that I've moved on. But the truth is, I'm haunted by the thought that whatever happened out there is still happening, that the creature is still out in the wild, wearing my face or Danny's face, or maybe it's even wearing yours. Because sometimes, late at night, I can almost hear Kodiak's bark echoing through the darkness, followed by a voice that sounds a lot like my own, whispering, "You never left." And the worst part? Deep down, I'm not entirely sure I ever did. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 28 years old. This happened in August of 2024, and the memory of it still haunts me like a recurring nightmare. I wish I could say I'm writing all this down because I finally found a way to make peace with what happened. But the truth is, I don't think I'll ever find peace. Not really. Some things change you forever. I live in Fairbanks, Alaska, where I work as a mechanical engineer. Or at least I did before all of this. My job kept me tethered to a computer most days, crunching numbers and designing parts for mining equipment. After a few years of the 9-to-5 grind, I started feeling a strain on my mind. My last relationship had recently gone down in flames, and I was sick of waking to the same routine, day in and day out. I needed air, real, fresh, Alaskan air, without the smell of diesel or office coffee pots. That's why I chose Kobuk Valley National Park for a week-long solo trek. I wanted solitude to clear my thoughts of heartbreak and burnout. It was late summer, which can be surprisingly hot for Alaska, but the nights still got cold. I figured the wild remoteness of Kobuk would help me find what I was looking for. I'm no hardened wilderness survivalist, but I've camped and hiked enough to feel confident. I packed carefully, a lightweight tent, a week's worth of freeze-dried meals, a water filter, emergency flares, map, compass, and GPS. My phone was fully charged, and I brought a solar charger. My dog, Shadow, a husky I'd adopted from a local shelter, was coming along. He was a stocky, strong dog used to the cold. I'd trust him with my life out there before I'd trust most people. We drove up as far as the roads would allow, then hiked north until we reached an area of the park known for its shifting sand dunes. It's a surreal patch of desert-like terrain surrounded by tundra and spindly spruce trees. The dunes can get scorching hot during the day, and at night the temperature can plummet. As we crested a small rise, I got my first real view of that strange landscape. I remember thinking it looked like someone had dropped a piece of the Sahara in the middle of nowhere. I set up camp near a bend in the Kobuk River on my second day. The first night had been calm, but I was exhausted from hiking and drifted off to sleep without much thought. The second night is when everything began to feel wrong. The sun hung low in the sky, a weird orange circle that refused to dip completely below the horizon until close to midnight. Alaska's summers are like that, especially in the northern areas. I cooked a small portion of rice and freeze-dried vegetables, fed Shadow, and we settled into the tent. I remember checking my phone one last time before shutting it down to conserve battery. The GPS had worked fine, though it occasionally took longer than usual to load the maps. Around 2 a.m, I woke to Shadow growling. A low, rumbling warning, the kind a dog makes when something is close by, too close. I froze, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the stirring wind. Then, I picked up a faint rustling outside the tent, a shuffle of feet on sand. I told myself it was just an animal, a fox, or maybe a lynx. Then, I heard my own voice whisper, "Shadow. Shadow." It was so quiet I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, but the dog tensed, his growl deepening. The voice was definitely there, somewhere outside the nylon walls of the tent, calling my dog by name. And it sounded just like me, same pitch, same inflection. Every hair on my neck stood up, my heart hammered in my ears. I didn't move, didn't dare unzip the tent. Shadow lowered his body, lips peeled back, ready to lunge if something came through. After a few seconds, silence. Just the wind again. I must have sat there, wide-eyed, for a good hour, waiting for more. Eventually, I dozed off, lulled by my own exhaustion. When I woke in the morning, the campsite was undisturbed, at least on the surface. But I found fresh footprints in the sand, bare human feet that circled my tent twice. They led out into the dunes, then vanished as if wiped away. There were no other tracks coming or going. I tried to laugh it off as some weird dream or maybe an echo in my half-awake brain. People tell themselves all sorts of things to not freak out. But Shadow's hackles rising told me we weren't alone out there. Despite the lingering unease, I decided to push on. I wasn't about to turn back after 2 days. I set a course deeper into the valley. I had my map, compass, and GPS. The trail wasn't official. Kobuk is mostly wilderness, but I'd planned out a rough route that would take me along the river before looping back. That day, the sun beat down as I crossed the dunes. The heat radiated up in shimmering waves. At one point, I checked my compass. It spun slowly, stopping and starting with no real north. I tapped it, thinking it was stuck, but it kept drifting. Then my GPS displayed an error message. A no satellite connection icon popped up. That was odd because I'd had a clear signal just an hour ago. Frustrated, I pressed on using the map. I tried to follow the contour lines and keep the river in view, but the landscape seemed off. Dunes that should have been in one area appeared in another. The shape of the river bend felt reversed. More than once, I found myself backtracking to points I was sure I'd passed miles ago. That evening, I was thoroughly disoriented. The strangest part was how quickly the sunlight shifted. Like entire hours passed in mere minutes. I'd look at the sun, note its position, walk for what felt like half an hour, then glance up to find it had descended drastically. By the time I found a semi-flat patch of tundra to camp on, I was emotionally spent. Shadow seemed to sense my anxiety, staying closer to me than usual. I made a small fire, though it took an unreasonable amount of effort to catch a flame, almost like the wood was damp or something intangible was fighting against the spark. When I finally got a fire going, the flames burned with an odd bluish tint at the edges. I ate quickly, not tasting my food, then crawled into my sleeping bag with Shadow at my feet. I kept my pocket knife tucked near my thigh just in case. Sleep came grudgingly. Sometime during the night I snapped awake, heart thudding. I had no clue why, until I realized the fire was out, completely cold. According to my watch, I'd been asleep barely 40 minutes. That didn't make sense. The wood was still fresh when I dozed off, and there's no way it should have been that cold. Something crunched behind me, and Shadow let out a sharp bark. I turned on my flashlight just in time to catch a glimpse of a figure darting behind a spruce. The beam of light flickered, and the batteries died instantly, as if drained in a single moment. I scrambled out of the tent, knife in hand. "Hello?" I called. No answer, just the emptiness of the tundra night. I couldn't see anyone, but I had the unsettling impression of eyes everywhere. The crunch of boots or feet in the distance, then that silence again, the kind that makes your teeth ache. Morning light, if you can call it that in August, came eventually. I poked my head out of the tent and rubbed my eyes. The fear from the night lingered, but the rational part of me tried to put it aside. I needed to figure out where I was and how to get back on track. My phone had battery, though I'd powered it off. I turned it on, no service, but at least I could check the GPS function. Still nothing. The icon simply circled, searching for satellites that apparently weren't there. I let out a long, tense breath. This was going to be one of those trips that tested me in ways I wasn't prepared for. But I had enough supplies for several days, so I told myself it'd be fine. I moved on, forging ahead by following the river's curve. At least I could navigate by that. By midday, I spotted a wisp of smoke in the distance. Part of me hesitated. What if it was some crazy hermit or someone who wanted to be left alone? But the desire for human contact won out. If there was a chance they had a working phone or knowledge of the area, I'd take it. Maybe I'd also get an explanation for the weird events. So I headed toward the smoke. As I approached, I realized it was a small camp, complete with a green tent, a folding chair, and a camera tripod set up near the water. A tall man with a bushy beard was bent over a campfire, stirring something in a small pot. He looked up as I neared, and I was instantly relieved by his normal, human expression of mild surprise. "Hey," he called. "You lost, buddy?" "Honestly, yeah," I admitted, mustering a shaky smile. "Name's Mike Carter. Sorry to barge in. I'm just having some troubles with my gear." The man introduced himself as Jake Simmons, a wildlife photographer working on a personal project documenting the park's unique dunes and local fauna. He noticed my dog, and Shadow greeted him with a cautious sniff. Usually, Shadow is friendly, but he seemed uneasy, looking around Jake's campsite as though expecting something to leap out. Jake offered me a seat by the fire. It felt good to be near normal warmth again, though I noticed his flames flickered in an odd pattern, like there was a draft swirling around the campsite. Could have been the wind. Could have been me reading too much into it. We talked for a bit. Jake said he'd been out there for nearly 2 weeks, had spotted a few moose, even a wolverine, and was hoping to film some time-lapse shots of the dunes at night. When I explained the weirdness I'd encountered, the failing compass, the glitching GPS, he frowned thoughtfully. He admitted he'd seen strange lights at night, but wrote them off as distant auroras or illusions from the midnight sun. While we spoke, he kept glancing toward the trees. At one point, I asked if everything was all right. He shrugged it off, saying, "I don't like staying in one spot too long here, that's all. Something about this place, too quiet." I decided to camp nearby, grateful for the company. Jake seemed relieved to have someone to share the evening with, though I caught him eyeing the horizon more than once, like he expected something. I tried pressing him for details, but he just said, "Locals talk about spirits in these woods, but who knows?" That evening, after we both ate, we sat around his fire swapping travel stories. I told him about some of my simpler hikes around the state, and he told me about photographing polar bears along the Arctic coast. It was almost enough to make me forget the tension in the air. Almost. It was around midnight that Jake decided to go for a short walk to collect more firewood. Shadow and I stayed behind, finishing off our dinner. The temperature dropped fast. The sky above was clear, revealing stars in a tapestry of cosmic brilliance. I couldn't take my eyes off them for a while. Maybe that's why I didn't notice how long Jake had been gone. Eventually, I realized it had been over an hour since he left. Concerned, I grabbed my flashlight and whistled for Shadow. We walked in the direction Jake had gone, calling his name. My voice echoed in the quiet, but there was no answer. Just the soft hush of the breeze against the trees. Another 15 minutes passed before I found Jake. He was standing by the river, water lapping around his ankles. He stared at the dark surface as though entranced by his own reflection. I flicked on my flashlight, and the beam fell across his face. "Jake?" I said. No response. He didn't even blink. "Hey man, you okay?" Slowly, he turned. The expression on his face was blank, as if he had no idea who I was or why I was there. He didn't speak, he just smiled, an odd, too wide smile, and stepped out of the water. His boots made sucking noises against the mud, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "Let's get back to camp," I suggested, trying not to show how unsettled I felt. "You've been gone a while." He followed me wordlessly. The entire walk back he stared at nothing, his eyes unfocused. At one point he touched my shoulder, and I nearly jumped. I half expected him to speak, but he just gave that weird smile again. When we reached the campsite, Jake stood there silently, refusing to sit or acknowledge me. I went into my tent with Shadow, thinking he might snap out of it if I gave him some space. That night, something invaded my dreams. Or maybe it was real. I heard footsteps around my tent, quiet at first, then urgent. My sleeping bag felt sticky and heavy, like it was covered in dew or something thicker. I tried to move, but felt paralyzed. A voice whispered, "I can see you," in my own voice. I swear I felt warm breath on my neck. My heart pounded so hard I expected it to burst. I woke drenched in sweat at dawn, or what passes for dawn in that place, and flung myself upright. Shadow was curled at my feet, eyes wide and anxious. My sleeping bag was half-zipped, but from the inside, as if someone had unzipped it while I slept. My body tingled with adrenaline, and I sprang out of the tent. Jake was nowhere to be seen. I called out, and eventually he emerged from behind a boulder, though I hadn't heard a single footstep. He looked normal again, at least more so than the night before. He claimed he'd just been going for a morning walk to see if he could photograph any wildlife near the river. His memory of the previous night's events was fuzzy. He asked if I'd slept well, as if nothing strange had happened. I wanted to leave. Something about Jake or this entire situation reeked of danger. But my curiosity and my sense of responsibility got the better of me. He was alone out here too. If something was wrong with him, a head injury maybe, I didn't want to abandon him. I suggested we pack up and hike out together, or at least return to a point where we could get better GPS reception. He agreed, but insisted we wait until midday to get some decent light for navigation. While we waited, he busied himself taking photos of the area. I kept close watch on him. Shadow stuck to my side, tail low. We started hiking around noon, or so said my watch. The sun was bright overhead. We tried to follow the river, but after 2 hours I realized the river's bend was curving in the wrong direction compared to the map. It was as if the landscape was actively rearranging itself around us. My compass still spun aimlessly, pointing nowhere. Jake kept stopping to snap pictures of random patches of trees, or the river, or me, always with that slight, lingering smile. By late afternoon, clouds gathered. Rain threatened, so we hurried to find a spot to shelter. We stumbled on another place to camp, a shallow area with a bit of tree cover. It was better than nothing. That night, things escalated. I started a fire, or tried to. The tinder refused to catch. Even when the flame finally licked the wood, it died almost immediately, leaving behind a sickly chemical odor. Finally, after draining half a bottle of lighter fluid, which should have been more than enough, the fire sputtered to life. The entire time, Jake watched me with a vacant expression. "Jake," I said, "do you have anything dry we can burn?" He didn't respond, just sat there hugging his camera to his chest. Eventually, I gave up. The fire was weak, flickering as though something was actively trying to kill it. We had some cold rations, then retreated into our tents. Shadow would not leave my side, and the tension in his body told me he sensed something deeply wrong in Jake's presence. Sometime in the night I woke up to a rustling sound outside the tent. Shadow growled, low and menacing. I grabbed my flashlight, but it was dead again, despite fresh batteries. My phone was powerless, even though it should have had at least half a charge. Panic fluttered inside me. Suddenly, the zipper to my tent began to open from the outside. I lunged, trying to hold it closed, but whatever was out there was strong. The tent ripped near the seam, letting in a flood of freezing air. In the faint moonlight, I saw a shape stooping to enter. Before I could strike with my knife, a voice hissed, "Mike, it's already inside." I recognized the voice as Jake's, but something was off. The timbre, the pitch, it was layered, as if multiple voices spoke in unison. I slashed wildly and felt the blade connect with flesh. A shriek tore through the night and the shape jerked back. Shadow lunged, snapping and snarling. The figure vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a foul odor like rotting seaweed. I scrambled out of the tent. The moon was bright enough to reveal Jake standing a few yards away. Only he looked different. His posture was contorted, shoulders hunched, head tilted. He wore a grin that stretched across his face in a way no human face should. A thick, dark substance dripped from his forearm. My blow must have cut him, but he didn't act hurt. Shadow rushed forward, barking furiously. Jake swung around almost too fast for me to follow, and I heard a sickening thud. The dog yelped, flying backward. My heart plummeted. "Shadow!" I screamed. I rushed to him, but Jake was on me in a heartbeat impossibly fast. He knocked me down, pinned me against the tundra. Up close, his eyes looked dead. There was no flicker of recognition there, no humanity. He whispered, "I'm so hungry," in that same layered voice. Then he let out a hideous laugh that devolved into an inhuman growl. I fought back, managing to knee him in the stomach and scramble away. Shadow, bless him, rose to his feet, limping. Blood matted his fur along his side. I was certain he was gravely injured, but my loyal friend still tried to stand between me and whatever Jake had become. Everything happened in a blur. Jake lunged at Shadow with a jagged rock in hand. I screamed for him to stop. The rock came down, and Shadow let out a final heartrending yelp. Then he went still. All the air left my lungs. I stabbed at Jake with my knife, but the blade scraped across his ribs, and he barely reacted, as though pain meant nothing. When he turned to face me, I was sure I was next. Somehow, adrenaline fueled me. I leapt forward, slashing at his torso. The creature hissed, doubling over. In that moment, I saw something move beneath his skin, as if a twisted form was shifting inside him. His face flickered. Jake's features melted into an image of my own face, then Shadow's muzzle, then something else entirely. A hairless, elongated snout, eyes that glowed with predatory intensity. I stumbled back, nearly retching at the sight. The creature let out a rasping laugh, a gurgling that shook its entire frame. Then it sank into the darkness between the trees, leaving me alone with Shadow's body. Time felt meaningless. I held my dog, sobbing, the metallic smell of blood everywhere. My body shook with rage, grief, and fear. Rain started to fall, cold droplets that quickly turned the ground to slick mud. I looked around, but the thing wearing Jake's form was gone. The darkness around me seemed alive. I couldn't abandon Shadow's body, not like that out in the open. Even though I had nothing to properly bury him with, I pulled him under a small outcropping of rock where the ground was drier. I covered him with stones as best I could, tears blurring my vision. I whispered a goodbye, though the words caught in my throat. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I had to get out of there, or I'd meet the same fate. My supplies were scattered around the ruined tent, my backpack half torn. I grabbed what I could, knife, some food, my map, and the worthless GPS. My entire body trembled, but I had to keep going. I started walking under the veil of rain, aiming to reach the main river and follow it downstream. Maybe I'd find a ranger station or a search party. My only guiding thought was survival. As I walked, my mind kept replaying the horror. The moment Jake, or that thing, killed Shadow, I alternated between despair and blazing anger, wanting revenge against the thing that had taken him from me. But anger wasn't going to keep me alive alone. I had to keep my wits about me. The ground was slick, and soon the drizzle turned into a downpour. I nearly slipped multiple times. My watch said it was around 4 in the morning, but the sky looked more like it was early evening. I thought perhaps the clouds were just thick, but there was a sense that time itself was warping again. I pressed on for hours. The day brightened slightly, enough for me to at least see the uneven terrain. My mind started playing tricks. Every crooked branch or fallen log looked like a twisted figure lurking at the edge of my vision. I flinched at every sound. When I finally paused to rest, my stomach felt hollow. I realized I hadn't eaten or drunk anything since the incident. Shaking, I opened my bag. The food inside smelled rancid. Even the sealed packets were covered in mold that seemed to have sprouted overnight. My water bladder was warm and tasted foul, as if it had been stagnant for weeks. Fighting nausea, I forced myself to chew one of the less rotten bars. It still had a bitter, off taste that made me gag, but I needed the calories. After that, I continued trudging, looking for any sign of humanity. Suddenly, I saw a flash of color through the trees, a bright orange scrap of fabric. Hope ignited in my chest. Maybe another camper or hiker had set up camp. I hurried toward it, ignoring the stabs of pain in my legs. I found the remains of a campsite, though it looked as if it had been abandoned for months. The tent was in tatters, covered in moss. A rusted cooking pot lay near the cold ashes of a fire pit. I found footprints, but they were old, caked with mud and partially eroded. A sense of intense wrongness overwhelmed me. This place seemed ancient, yet the gear was of a modern style, not something decades old. Out of morbid curiosity, I checked inside the ripped tent. Moldy sleeping bags, shredded from the inside out. I spied a battered wallet lying in one corner. Inside was a driver's license belonging to a man named Christopher Dorsey, age 40. It had expired in 2022, only 2 years earlier. My stomach dropped. This hadn't been here that long, yet it looked like it had weathered centuries. I had the terrifying realization that time was truly warped here, that perhaps days or weeks could pass in a single night, maybe even entire seasons. A branch snapped nearby. I bolted upright, knife in hand, heart thrashing. Was it the creature again? I scanned the shadows. For a split second, I thought I saw Jake's face peering from behind a tree. Those vacant eyes, that unnatural grin. But when I blinked, there was nothing there. I didn't wait to find out. I ran. I tore through the undergrowth, ignoring the stings of branches against my arms and cheeks. Rain battered me, turning the trail to muck. My foot caught on a root and I face-planted into the mud. The fall knocked the wind out of me. My limbs felt like lead, my lungs burned. I struggled back to my feet, spitting out dirt. Pain lanced my shoulder. It felt like a sprain. I pressed my hand to it, wincing. I needed to calm down or I'd be completely vulnerable to another attack. I took several deep breaths, ignoring the reek of decay that seemed to cling to the air. I had to think strategically. I decided to make a shelter and try to gather enough wood to keep a fire going. Without warmth, in this weather, I'd risk hypothermia. I found a small rocky overhang near a cluster of pine trees. It offered minimal protection from the rain, but it was better than nothing. Gathering dry wood was nearly impossible, but I managed to find some dead branches that were slightly sheltered. Every time the wind gusted, I expected to see that figure looming in the periphery. My nerves were shot. I jumped at my own shadow more than once. When I finally tried to build a fire, the lighter refused to catch properly. Sparks fizzled. I cursed under my breath, trying again and again, my hands shaking. After what felt like an eternity, a tiny flame caught. I fed it twigs and small sticks, then gradually larger pieces. The flames burned with a bizarre hue, almost greenish-blue near the bottom. I stared at it, half in terror, half in fascination. It felt as though the fire was alive in a way it shouldn't be. I lost track of time. I sat there, warming my hands, fighting the sobs that kept rising. My mind drifted to Shadow's final moments. Guilt gnawed at me. What if I had reacted faster? Could I have saved him? Sometime later, maybe hours, maybe minutes, I heard sloshing footsteps approaching. I scrambled up, knife in one hand, a burning stick in the other. The footsteps came closer, then paused. In the dim glow of the fire, Jake emerged from the darkness. At least, it wore Jake's face. His clothing was torn and muddy, his beard caked in filth. A long gash ran across his torso, oozing a dark liquid. He stared at me with those hollow eyes. "Why did you leave me?" the thing whispered in Jake's voice, but the tone was off, like multiple voices layered together. "I couldn't find you." "Stay back," I warned, gripping the knife tightly. My heart hammered so loud I thought it might burst. The creature took a step closer. "Mike, I need help." It imitated a pathetic expression, eyes wide, mouth trembling. but the corners of that mouth stayed curled upward in a silent grin that never faded. A glimmer of mania danced in those pupils. "Get away from me!" I screamed, thrusting the burning branch in its direction. The flames cast flickering shadows across the thing's gaunt face. It let out a sound that started like a sob but twisted into laughter halfway through. "He was a good dog," it said, and licked its lips. I felt sick, every muscle rigid. So loyal. Rage flared in me like an inferno. I swung the burning branch in a wide arc, trying to keep it at bay, then lunged with my knife. The tip caught its shoulder. It snarled, snapping its teeth mere inches from my face. A vile stench of rot wafted from its breath. "Why do you fight?" it hissed. "You're already lost here. Time belongs to me." A primal surge of adrenaline took over. I tackled it to the ground. We rolled across the muddy earth, the firelight illuminating our violent struggle. Up close, the illusions flickered across Jake's face again. At times, it looked like Shadow's muzzle, or even my own face, twisted with hatred. It whispered vile secrets about how I would die out here, how no one would find me. We fought until my arms burned, until the knife bit into flesh again and again. The creature screamed, an unholy sound that rattled my teeth. Finally, I managed to pin it beneath me, pressing my knee into its back. With trembling fury, I stabbed at its leg, feeling the blade connect with bone. Its shriek tore through the night, and the illusions on its face flickered wildly, like a glitching screen. Somehow, I found the strength to drive the knife deeper, twisting it. It let out a rasping growl and lashed out, sending me tumbling sideways. I scrambled to my feet, expecting it to leap for me again. Instead, it writhed on the ground, clutching its leg. A black, tar-like substance gushed from the wound. I stumbled backward, chest heaving. The creature glared at me, eyes filled with a hate so intense it felt physical. Then, with a snarl, it crawled away into the darkness, dragging its wounded leg behind it. For a long moment, I was too stunned to move. My ears rang and my vision blurred. Rain pelted me, washing away some of the gore from my knife and arms. My mouth tasted like copper from where I'd bitten my cheek. I wanted to collapse and sleep for 100 years, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Limping, I gathered what remained of my things. The fire was nearly out, the branches soaked. I couldn't risk staying in one spot. Even wounded, that thing might come back for me, or it might wait until day broke, if day ever really broke in this twisted place. Stumbling through the woods, I clung to the hope that I might find the main river again, or maybe a trail that led out. The hours blurred together. At times, I'd catch glimpses of the creature's shape in the distance, or hear a mocking laugh echo through the trees. I kept walking, blindly following the slope of the land, ignoring the protest of my muscles and the searing pain in my bruised shoulder. Somehow, I reached a wide gravel bar near a bend in the Kobuk River. The water was high from the rain, rushing and swirling with a ferocity that promised a cold, dangerous crossing. But across the river I saw something that made my breath hitch. A ranger's cabin, or at least a small building that looked official. It had to be the park ranger's outpost. If I could get there, I might find a radio or some means of contact. With the creature possibly hunting me, I couldn't risk going upstream or downstream looking for a safer crossing. I had to chance it here. Clutching my knife with numb fingers, I waded in. The current almost swept me off my feet. The icy water bit into my legs. Each step was an exercise in desperation. The water rose to my waist, then my chest. I nearly lost my footing multiple times, but adrenaline and sheer terror kept me upright. At one point, a log hurtled downstream, slamming into my side and spinning me around. Water closed over my head, and I inhaled a lungful before breaching the surface, choking. My foot found a rock, and I pushed off, managing to keep from being carried away. Step by agonizing step, I inched across, battered by the current, until at last the water shallowed near the other bank. I crawled onto the gravel, every muscle shaking uncontrollably. I coughed up river water, gasping. Above me, the small structure stood maybe 50 yards inland, a beacon of potential safety. I lurched to my feet and stumbled forward. Reaching the ranger station felt surreal. It was a squat, single-room cabin on stilts, designed to withstand seasonal flooding. The windows were shuttered, the door locked. I pounded on it with the last of my strength. No answer. Finally, I used the butt of my knife to smash the window. I climbed inside, cutting my forearms on shards of glass. The interior was dark, musty. I flicked on a light switch out of habit. Amazingly, a dim overhead bulb flickered to life, powered by some generator or solar panel. I found a single cot, a small wood stove, and a locked cabinet. My reflection in the broken glass of the window was gaunt and hollow-eyed. But what made me reel back in horror was that my reflection didn't blink when I did. For a split second it just stared, smiling. Then it synchronized with my movements again. I sank to the floor, chest heaving, half mad with fatigue. I could still sense that thing out there, possibly clawing its way around the cabin's perimeter. For a brief moment I worried it might find a way inside, but the building felt safer than the open woods. I forced myself up. The cabinet was locked, but the latch was old. A few blows with a sturdy piece of wood from the corner, and it snapped open. Inside, I found a radio, a flare gun, and some emergency rations. My hands shook with relief. The radio had a manual crank. I tested it. Static hissed, but that was better than silence. "Mayday," I croaked into it. "This is Michael Carter. I'm at a ranger station in Kobuk Valley. If anyone can hear me, please respond." Nothing but static. I tried different frequencies, but no luck. Still, the mere existence of a radio gave me a shred of hope. I rummaged further, finding a battered first aid kit, enough to disinfect and wrap my cuts. The rations were minimal, but they weren't rotted. I scarfed down some high-calorie bars, ignoring the dryness that made me cough. I guzzled water from a dusty gallon jug, praying it wasn't tainted. Outside, I heard a faint scraping, like claws on wood. My pulse hammered. I clutched the flare gun, ready to shoot anything that forced its way in. A long silence stretched. Finally, the scraping stopped. I waited an hour, maybe two, dozing off in the corner, the flare gun balanced on my knee. When I jerked awake, the overhead light still glowed, faint and wavering. I dared to hope that maybe the creature had bled out or retreated to whatever dark hole it crawled from. I stood, ignoring the protest of every muscle, and limped to the mirror on the back wall, a small one used by rangers to check their gear, presumably. My reflection stared back. I blinked once, twice. This time it blinked with me. For a moment I almost believed I was free, but the reflection's lips twitched, forming a silent "no." Then it snapped back into alignment. I had to get out of Alaska, or at least out of this hellish region. My best chance was to wait for morning, hoping morning was a real thing, and see if I could get the radio to connect with someone. That, or shoot a flare if a rescue plane or helicopter happened by. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, harsh sunlight spilled through the broken window. My watch read 2:17 p.m., though it had said 9 p.m. an hour before. I stared at it, feeling my sanity teeter. However, daylight gave me a burst of energy. I tested the radio again. On one frequency, I heard something that might have been a distant voice. I cranked the handle furiously, trying to boost the signal, but I couldn't make out any words. Still, it was a sign. Maybe if I hiked to higher ground, I could call for help. I considered staying in the cabin, but the creature knew where I was, and there was no guarantee rescue would come before nightfall. If nightfall even worked normally here. The memory of the scraping sounds outside chilled me. So I packed the flare gun, some rations, and the first aid kit. I wrapped my battered feet in fresh socks I found in a locker. My shoulder throbbed constantly, but I strapped it tight with gauze to keep it from moving too much. Then I left the cabin, blinking against the intense sunlight. The day was eerily calm. Not a breeze, not a sound of birds. Even the river seemed quieter. I trudged south along a faint path, presumably used by rangers. My plan was to get to a vantage point, maybe a small hill or ridge where I could try the radio again. As I walked, I sensed something behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just that intangible, oppressive presence. Once or twice, I glimpsed a shape behind distant trees. A silhouette crawling, dragging itself. Part of me rejoiced, believing the creature was too wounded to stand. Another part of me feared that it was biding its time, letting me exhaust myself before striking again. I kept going, forcing one foot in front of the other. After what felt like hours, I came upon a rocky outcrop that rose above the forest. The climb up was difficult, especially with my shoulder, but eventually I stood at the edge, looking out over a vast expanse of pine and tundra. Off in the distance, I saw the winding river. The dunes were beyond that, shimmering in the heat haze. It looked so empty, so alien. I raised the radio. "Hello? Anyone? This is Michael Carter, in Kobuk Valley National Park. I need help, please." Static greeted me. But then, faintly, I heard something like a reply. A burst of static, then a garbled voice. My heart soared. I adjusted the dial, but the voice cut out. When it came back, it was clearer, a man's voice. "Repeat, location, over." I nearly sobbed with relief. I'm near the main river, by a rocky outcrop, maybe 10 miles north of the visitor center. I don't know, my GPS is out. There's something out here. I've been attacked. I need immediate rescue. Silence for a moment, then, understood, sending a chopper from Bettles. Remain calm. Find an open area to set a flare. Over. Copy, I breathed. My entire body shook. "I'll do that. Thank you, thank you." I ended the transmission, clutching the radio like a lifeline. A wave of emotion hit me. Relief, guilt that Shadow wasn't here to see me escape. But maybe I would survive this after all. I hurried downhill, searching for a clearing big enough for a helicopter to land or at least to be spotted. I found a patch of tundra near the base of the outcrop, a relatively open space. It felt exposed, but that was the point. I readied the flare gun, scanning the skies. Time crawled. The sun sank lower, or maybe it was rising. I couldn't tell anymore. My watch was worthless. Then I heard it. The distant thrum of rotor blades. I peered upward, heart pounding. A black dot emerged against the horizon, growing steadily. The wind kicked up around me as the helicopter swooped in, circling the clearing. I waved both arms, practically jumping for joy. I fired the flare. It streaked through the sky in a brilliant arc of red, then fizzled out. The helicopter hovered, preparing to land. I shielded my eyes from the dust and debris kicked up by the rotors. But in the swirling dust, I saw something move at the tree line. A crouched figure dragging itself forward. The creature. I glimpsed its pale, inhuman face and the black tar that oozed from its wounded leg. It reached out a clawed hand, letting out a roar that cut through the helicopter's noise. Panic seized me. I wanted to run, but the helicopter was just landing. Two figures inside were gesturing for me to approach. I sprinted forward, ignoring the searing pain in my limbs. Behind me, the creature let out a keening wail. I risked a glance back and saw it trying to stand, its leg twisted at an impossible angle. Its features morphing rapidly between Jake's face, Shadow's muzzle, and something else. something no words can properly describe. I stumbled toward the helicopter, half blind from the dust. A ranger jumped out, wearing a headset and motioning for me. "Come on," he shouted. "Move!" I clambered inside, flopping onto the floor. Another ranger pulled the door shut. The pilot lifted off, the engine whining. Through the window, I saw the creature below, an ant-like figure gazing up, mouth wide in silent fury. Then the trees and tundra dropped away beneath us. For the first time in days, or maybe weeks, I felt a flicker of genuine safety. The rangers tried to question me, but I was half delirious. I mumbled about the creature, about Jake, about Shadow. Their expressions turned grim when they saw my cuts, my ragged clothes, and the haunted look in my eyes. We reached Bettles, a small community with an airstrip. My memory is patchy after that. Doctors, bright hospital lights, sedatives. They told me I was severely dehydrated, half-starved, and in shock. The official story that went into the report was exposure and hallucinations due to hypothermia, and that Michael Carter encountered a violent trespasser or an animal. They found no trace of Jake Simmons, nor any sign of the monstrous entity I described. No one believed me. They chalked it up to a broken mind under extreme stress. They scanned my shoulder, set it in a sling, and kept me under observation for a while. I was free to go once they decided I wasn't a danger to myself. The rangers offered condolences about my dog, saying there was no sign of him out there either. Even now, I can't fully explain what happened in Kobuk Valley. The official record doesn't match my truth. But I know what I saw, what killed my dog, and wore my face. I can still feel its presence in my nightmares. Sometimes, at night, I catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, my reflection in a mirror that doesn't quite move in sync. It's like part of that place came back with me, or maybe it never really let me go. I haven't been back into the wild since. My gear sits in a trunk collecting dust. I don't hike anymore. Every so often I wake up in a cold sweat, certain that I hear my own voice whispering from under my bed, "Shadow, Shadow." The memory stabs me with grief and terror, and that is my story. Believe it or don't, but if you ever find yourself in Kobuk Valley or any remote corner of Alaska, keep your eyes open and your dog close. Some places were never meant for humans, and some things hunger for more than just your flesh. They want you, your spirit, your identity, your very sense of time. And once they've had a taste, they never stop following you. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 29 years old, and this happened in late August 2023. For a long time, I hesitated to tell anyone what really happened out there in Anyakchak National Monument and Preserve in Alaska. Even now, whenever I close my eyes, I see glimpses of that broken tree, the noose, and whatever wore Marcus's face. But I need to tell this story. Maybe getting it all out in the open will help me sleep again. I'm not a veteran or a highly trained outdoorsman, far from it. I'm a travel vlogger with an overblown sense of confidence. I'd been building my online channel for 2 years by traveling to remote places and recording epic survival experiences. The truth is, I loved the rush of it all. The sense of being somewhere few people had ever been, capturing footage no one else had. But I mostly relied on local guides, well-worn trails, and half-decent gear. It was never as hardcore as I played it up to be on camera. Marcus Holt, who was 31 at the time, served as my cameraman and often my best friend. We'd met in college years before and ended up working together by chance. Marcus had a quiet, loyal streak that made him the perfect companion. He didn't speak up much about his own fears or needs, though sometimes I wished he did. He was the voice of reason, but he often let me push us beyond safe boundaries because he believed in me. Or maybe he just liked the adrenaline as much as I did. We decided to head into Anyakchak because we'd heard rumors about how remote, how absolutely untamed it was. Not many travelers go there. It's a volcanic caldera with unpredictable weather, difficult terrain, and almost zero infrastructure. Exactly the sort of place I thought would look amazing on film. Marcus was initially hesitant. He'd read up on the place and knew we might be in over our heads, but I assured him we'd be fine because we had hired a top-notch guide, Jesse Morgan. Jesse was 34, tough as nails, and had spent over a decade guiding expeditions in Alaska's backcountry. She didn't care about my YouTube channel or my desire to capture cinematic gold. She cared about the land, about respecting it, and most of all, about getting us in and out alive. She had the skill set. She was a no-nonsense woman, the type who believed if you messed around with nature, nature would break you. Straight up. She took one look at me and Marcus and told us we'd better follow her rules or she'd leave us in the dust. I half laughed, but she didn't return a smile. The final member of our party was my Siberian husky, Ghost. I'd found Ghost as a rescue a year prior, and he'd been on several shorter trips with me. He was a beautiful dog, gray and white fur, ice blue eyes, and a temperament that oscillated between friendly and fiercely protective. He usually loved exploring new territory, but from the second we arrived near Anyakchak, he seemed on edge, whining and pacing more than usual. We flew into King Salmon, then hopped on a small charter flight that dropped us near the boundary of Anyakchak National Monument. We'd planned to hike along the caldera rim, camp for 5 days, record some epic drone shots, then circle back. That was the plan. I remember the uneasy look on the pilot's face when he dropped us off. He said something about how the weather could turn nasty in a heartbeat and to watch out for brown bears in the area. Then he looked at Jesse and added, "I'm sure you know what you're doing." It almost sounded like a warning. The plane took off, and I felt that familiar tingle in my gut. Excitement, nerves, the high of a complete isolation. We began our trek on a calm, overcast morning. The volcanic landscape stretched out before us like something from another planet. Black rocks, ash-covered ridges, steam vents in the distance from geothermal activity. Wind howled across the open stretches. The air tasted metallic, tinted with sulfur. Jesse led the way, carrying most of our heavier communal gear. Marcus and I had our own packs with camera equipment, personal items, and enough food for a week, plus a small buffer. Ghost darted ahead and then back, sniffing at everything, tail wagging with that nervous energy. We walked for hours, and I filmed some segments talking about the terrain, the geology, the isolation. Marcus followed behind me, capturing wide shots and close-ups. That first day it felt like a typical, if grueling, backcountry hike. But things got strange almost immediately. We stopped for a lunch break around noon, according to my phone. After we ate jerky and granola bars, I checked the phone again. It now read 3:24 p.m. At first, I assumed the screen had locked, or maybe I had accidentally changed the time zone. But I had downloaded offline maps that also had a time readout. Those two indicated it was over 3 hours later than it should have been. Marcus's phone had died completely for no reason, even though I remembered him saying it was at 80% earlier. Jesse's watch read 12:15 p.m. "Must be a glitch," I said, forcing a laugh. I noticed the worry in Marcus's eyes, though he tried to hide it. Jesse shrugged. "Electromagnetic interference isn't uncommon near volcanic or geothermal areas," she said. Like that explained everything. "Anyway, we need to keep moving if we want to make camp before dark." We pushed on. By the time we reached a suitable spot, with a decent windbreak near a sparse patch of brush, The sun was already dipping behind the rim of the caldera. We pitched 2 tents, one for me and Marcus, one for Jesse. Ghost curled up next to me. The temperature dropped fast and we lit a campfire using a portable stove to get the flame going. The wind was fierce. The shapes of the rocks looked warped in the flickering firelight. At some point, Ghost let out a low growl, staring into the darkness beyond our campsite. I grabbed a flashlight and swept it around. Nothing. Marcus told me the dog was probably just freaked out by the wind. As we all settled in, Jesse told us stories about the place, about how some people came and never returned, how local legends spoke of restless spirits wandering near the crater. It sounded like the usual campfire ghost stories, but there was something in her voice that unsettled me. She believed there was a fundamental wrongness about certain pockets of wilderness, places people weren't meant to be. I remember Marcus actually laughing a bit at the superstition. "It's just a crater," he said. Jesse glanced at him sharply. "I've seen people freeze to death, starve, or just break down mentally in less threatening places than this. Show some respect." When we doused the fire and climbed into our tents, I checked my phone again. The time flickered, showing me 11:59 p.m., then 2:14 a.m., then resetting to 8:46 p.m. I cursed under my breath, tossed it aside, and told myself I'd figure it out in the morning. I woke to the sound of Ghost whimpering. Our tent was cold, colder than it should have been. Marcus was shivering in his sleeping bag, which was fully unzipped. I saw that mine, too, was open, though I was certain I'd zipped it up before sleeping. The strangest part, it looked like it had been unzipped from the inside slowly, carefully. "Dude, you messing with me?" I asked Marcus. He shook his head, still half asleep. We crawled outside. The sky was a dull gray, but the sun hadn't quite risen. Jessie was standing by the remains of the fire, looking pale. She held something in her hand, a rope, frayed and dirty, tied into a loop, a noose. "Where did you find that?" I asked, my heart lurching at the sight of it. She pointed to a small blackened tree about 30 feet away. Its trunk looked burnt, though I hadn't noticed any fire damage the night before. "It was hanging there," she said quietly. "Doesn't seem like old rope either. Might be fresh." Marcus walked over to the tree, but Ghost started snarling, hackles raised. That was enough for me to keep my distance. I felt a creeping dread in my stomach I couldn't explain. We were in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of miles from the nearest town, and yet there was this rope, tied into a noose, hanging from a burned tree. Jesse insisted we break camp immediately, but I wanted to stay at least another night to record more footage. Marcus looked uneasy, but he nodded at me. We'd traveled a long way for this. Jessie finally relented with a curt, "Fine," but she'd made it clear she thought we should leave sooner rather than later. We hiked deeper along the caldera rim. The wind carried an odd sulfuric smell that grew stronger the farther we went. We planned to check out a known hot spring area that had formed after a series of volcanic events. The hiking was brutal. Loose volcanic gravel that slid under our boots, hidden ravines and steep slopes. Around midday, we stopped near a rocky outcrop for a break. While I filmed, Ghost kept his distance, ears flattened, every so often letting out a low whine. Jessie scanned the horizon with binoculars. She muttered something about the environment looking off, like ridges had shifted or rocks had moved. Marcus, meanwhile, tried to start the camp stove to heat some water for instant noodles. The flame refused to catch. When it finally did, the flame burned a faint bluish color before going out again. Eventually, he got it lit properly, but he looked spooked. Then, for a moment, I blinked and everything changed. The sun, which had been high overhead, now hung lower in the sky, as if hours had passed. My throat went dry. "How long have we been here?" I asked. Jesse gave me a confused look. "About 20 minutes. Marcus checked his watch, or tried to. His watch had died sometime in the past hour, just like his phone had. My phone was still glitching, showing random times and dates. Jesse's watch read 12:35 p.m., but the sky looked like late afternoon. I filmed a quick monologue about the time anomalies, trying to explain them logically. Maybe electromagnetic fields, some bizarre local phenomenon. But deep down, I felt terrified. The look in Marcus's eyes told me he felt the same, though he tried to stay calm for my sake. We decided to set up camp earlier than usual, given the uncertain daylight. Jesse found a more sheltered spot behind a rock formation. We pitched the tents and tried to build a fire again. This time, the wood we'd collected seemed damp, even though it hadn't rained. We wasted almost an hour coaxing the flames to life. Night fell abruptly, like someone had snuffed out the sun. Ghost stood near my legs, ears perked. "You see something, boy?" I whispered. Suddenly, he bolted into the darkness. I grabbed a flashlight, calling after him, but he was gone. I panicked. No way was I losing my dog in a place like this. Marcus offered to help search, but Jessie told us to stay close. She'd circle around the area. She had a powerful headlamp and better knowledge of the terrain. Marcus and I stood there, scanning the blackness beyond the firelight. 10 minutes later, Ghost came trotting back on his own, hackles raised. He stared past me, looking behind my shoulder into the dark. I swung around with the flashlight. "Nothing." Jessie returned, shaking her head. "No sign of anything." But she looked rattled. She wouldn't meet my eyes. When it was time to settle down, Marcus offered to gather some extra firewood in case the night grew colder. "I won't go far," he said. Jessie tried to protest, but he insisted. "We'll need a fire burning all night for warmth." I watched him disappear behind a cluster of boulders with the flashlight. Jessie asked me to help her check the perimeter of the camp for stable ground. Ghost followed at our heels. We found nothing unusual. No footprints, no wildlife tracks, just loose gravel and ancient lava rock. But Marcus didn't return quickly. After half an hour, I started calling his name. No answer. Jessie and I ventured out to find him, the pit in my stomach growing. We found the spot where he'd been collecting sticks. Some were piled neatly, but he was nowhere in sight. I yelled his name so loudly my throat burned. Silence. Then, as we were about to head back to camp, Marcus strolled into view, wearing the same clothes, but somehow not the same. He carried a bundle of sticks and driftwood in his arms. He was smiling, and it looked forced, like he was testing out the shape of a grin for the first time. A predator's grin, almost. His eyes didn't seem to focus on me or on Jessie. "Took you a while?" I said, trying to sound casual. "You okay?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, just got turned around." He spoke calmly, but each word felt rehearsed. His blinking pattern was off, like he'd forgotten how often humans blink. Jessie nudged my arm, her expression saying, "Let's get back to camp now." We returned to the tents, and Marcus piled the wood near the fire ring. Ghost crept toward him, nose sniffing the air. Then Ghost snarled, ears flat against his head. Marcus just looked down at the dog, that unnerving grin never leaving his face. "What's wrong, buddy?" he asked, voice monotone. Ghost backed off, trembling. I tried to ask Marcus what happened out there, what took him so long, but he gave vague answers. He said he tripped, maybe lost track of time. Then he changed the subject abruptly, asking if the stove was still working. Jessie and I exchanged worried glances. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I started drifting off, I heard shifting sounds in the tent, like Marcus was moving around. Once, I peeked out of my sleeping bag and saw him sitting upright, eyes open, staring at me in the faint glow of our lantern. His face was void of emotion. When I tried to speak, he lay down without a word. Come morning, I woke to find my sleeping bag unzipped again. The air was so cold it burned my lungs. Marcus was outside, standing by the remains of the fire, still wearing that unnatural smile. I crawled out, stiff and anxious, and looked over at Jessie's tent. She was up and packing gear, a grim look on her face. I think we should head back, she said. We've seen enough. This place, something isn't right. Marcus shrugged. What's the hurry? We've only just started. Thought we were staying 5 days. I stared at him. The real Marcus would have been relieved if Jessie suggested leaving, especially after all these strange occurrences. But now, he seemed oddly invested in staying. I think Jessie's right, I said carefully. We've got some footage. We can fill the rest with commentary. Marcus's eyes flicked to me, the smile shrinking. We came all this way, Ethan. Don't you want to stick around, maybe find something unique? There was a tone in his voice I didn't recognize. I tried to laugh it off and said, let's just get going. Weather might turn. We don't want to be caught in a storm. I turned to Jessie, who gave me a sharp nod, like she was silently urging me not to provoke Marcus further. Despite the tension, we broke down camp and started retracing our route. That was the plan anyway, but the path we had walked just 2 days prior looked different. Our footprints were gone, sure, but that was expected with loose volcanic ash. Yet the rock formation seemed rearranged, as if in the middle of the night, someone or something had shifted entire boulders. Jessie kept checking the map and her compass, muttering under her breath. We walked for hours without finding any familiar landmarks. The sun overhead flickered in and out of clouds, making it impossible to judge the time. My phone showed random times. Marcus's phone and watch were dead. Jessie's watch insisted it was only 10 a.m., but the light made it look like mid-afternoon. Every so often, Ghost would start growling. We'd see nothing ahead, but he'd bare his teeth, trembling. Jessie led us toward a ridge she believed would give us a better vantage point. When we got there, I felt the blood drain from my face. It overlooked a lower section of the caldera, but nothing looked even remotely like the place we had been 2 days before. It was all twisted lava fields and jagged spires. We have to keep moving, Jessie said. If we can just follow the ridgeline. She trailed off, cursing softly. Marcus stood at the edge, looking down with that smile. What if we camp here again? Could be a great view for sunrise. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, he turned to me. Ethan, come here. Film this. I didn't move. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The wind picked up, carrying an acrid smell of sulfur. My instinct was to get off that ridge as quickly as possible. Jessie seemed to share my urgency. She'd scanned the horizon one more time, pointed to the southeast, and said, "We go that way. The map says that direction should eventually lead us down to a river. We follow the river and keep going until we're out of the caldera." She shot Marcus a look. "No stopping unless we have to." Marcus chuckled. "Whatever you say." We pressed on. The hike turned brutal, loose rock giving way underfoot, sudden drops where the earth crumbled. Marcus trailed behind us, silent except for occasional muttering. He kept whispering words like soon, or almost, or stay, but every time I asked, what was that? He'd act like he hadn't said anything. Ghost was the only reason I felt somewhat safe. The dog stuck to my side, occasionally trotting up to Jessie, but he never went near Marcus. We stopped briefly to eat a quick lunch. That's when we discovered more trouble. 2 of our food bags were full of mold. The bread, jerky, and trail mix we'd purchased were all in sealed packages, but now they reeked, with green and white fuzz covering everything. We had no explanation for how it had happened so fast. Jessie looked genuinely shaken. We had enough supplies for at least 5 days. This shouldn't be happening. Marcus just smiled again, in that disquieting way. "Guess we'll have to ration," he said. "Don't worry, I'm not very hungry." He stared at me when he said it, his eyes lingering. We drank water mixed with electrolyte powder, the only thing we could consume safely. Then we forged on, gritting our teeth. The wind battered us, making each step a chore. Ghost stuck close, ears flattened. Time warped again. One moment, I felt the piercing sunlight overhead. Then a few blinks later, I was stumbling in dim twilight. When we finally decided to set up camp for the night, it was too dark to see without headlamps. I asked Jessie what time her watch showed. "Says 6:20 p.m., she replied, but it felt like midnight. We found a relatively flat patch of ground near a cluster of dead, twisted trees. After pitching tents in the wind, we tried to light another fire. The wood we'd collected was damp, though it hadn't rained a drop. The flame sputtered, burning a sickly greenish color at first, then fading to normal orange. I was filming all of this, or at least trying to. My camera battery was draining unusually fast, so I rationed my shots, focusing on the weirdest phenomena. Meanwhile, Marcus just stood around not helping, that vacant smile plastered on his face. When it was time to settle in, I pulled Marcus aside. "Hey man, you're freaking me out. Are you okay? Did you get hurt out there? Did something happen?" He blinked rapidly, as if trying to remember how blinking worked. "Just excited," he said in a flat tone. "We're getting some great content, right? This is going to blow up your channel." I grimaced. "My channel isn't worth dying over." He laughed, a hollow sound. "Nobody's dying." Jessie whispered to me, "Keep an eye on him, something seriously off." She slid a knife from her pack and tucked it under her jacket. "I'm sleeping with this." I nodded, unease crawling up my spine. The idea that I might need protection from my own best friend was terrifying, but the changes in Marcus were undeniable. Even his posture was different. His shoulders hunched and his head seemed to loll slightly. Night was pure torment. Outside, the wind moaned. I heard branches scraping against each other in a slow, rhythmic creak. Every so often, Ghost let out a warning bark. At one point, I forced myself to unzip the tent flap and shine a light around. The landscape looked the same as before, except for a single detail. I saw a rope hanging from one of the dead trees, swaying in the wind. Another noose. Around what I guessed was 3 or 4 in the morning, I heard a strangled cry from Jessie's tent. I jolted up, grabbed my flashlight, and tore out of my sleeping bag. Marcus was already gone. He wasn't beside me. Outside, the moon, if it was the moon, cast a dull glow across the campsite. I saw Jessie struggling on the ground, pinned under Marcus, who had one hand around her throat. Ghost was barking furiously, snapping at Marcus's arm. I screamed and dove toward them, grabbing Marcus by the shoulders. He flung me aside with unnatural strength. Jessie gasped for air, managed to bring her knife around, slashing at Marcus's side. He barely reacted. In the eerie light, I could see the cut on his shirt, but no blood. His face twisted into a grimace, the first time his expression changed from that vacant smile. He hissed something. Words I couldn't understand, guttural and harsh. I scrambled to my feet, took a deep breath, and tackled him. We both hit the ground hard. Ghost pounced on him, teeth clamping onto his arm. Marcus howled, a sound that didn't even resemble a human voice. It was like an animal screech. Then, for a split second, his eyes cleared. "Ethan," he croaked, voice trembling, help me." His face twitched violently and the blank stare returned. He threw Ghost off, sending the dog tumbling. Jessie stumbled upright, clutching her throat and the knife. She slashed at Marcus again, drawing a deep line across his forearm, but something black trickled from the wound instead of red blood. I yelled at Jessie to run. We both made a mad dash away from the tents, Ghost at our heels. A few seconds later, I realized we'd left nearly everything behind. Packs, gear, phones, even the camera. And Marcus, or whatever was in Marcus's body, stood by the tents, head cocked at an impossible angle. Then the figure turned and walked into the darkness. Jessie and I huddled behind a boulder, breathing hard. She was shaking, and when I shone my flashlight on her throat, I saw deep bruises forming. "What the hell was that?" she rasped. I had no answer. Ghost whimpered, licking Jessie's hand. We stayed there, hearts pounding, for maybe half an hour, waiting to see if Marcus would come after us. Finally, we crept back to camp, knives at the ready. Marcus was nowhere to be found. Our tents were still standing, but his was torn open from the inside. A length of rope was tied to one of the tent poles. A noose again, dangling as if mocking us. Jessie insisted we leave everything but the essentials. She rummaged through her tent for her pack, stuffing in a few supplies. First aid kit, some water, whatever food hadn't rotted. My camera gear was scattered. I grabbed only my phone, though it was useless, and a small handheld camera with maybe half battery left. Ghost stuck close, trembling but alert. Marcus's pack was ripped open, its contents strewn around. That's when I noticed the smell. It was the overpowering stench of decay, like a dead animal left in the sun. I almost retched. Jessie's face contorted. She found the source near Marcus's sleeping bag, a chunk of rancid meat, human or animal, we couldn't tell. My stomach turned. Had Marcus been eating something? We couldn't linger. The night was still dark, and we had no idea how to navigate properly in this environment. But staying put felt even more dangerous, so we set off in the direction Jessie believed would lead us out of the caldera. We moved slowly, flashlight beams sweeping across the ground, Ghost walking between us. It felt like we walked for hours, stumbling over rocks and uneven ground. The smell of sulfur intensified. The wind whipped at us, howling in our ears, swirling ash around our faces. Several times I thought I saw movement at the edges of the flashlight beams, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. Jessie's watch still insisted it was somewhere around 3 a.m., but the sky began to lighten. Dawn was coming unnaturally fast, or maybe time just didn't flow right here. When the sun rose, we found ourselves at the top of a narrow ravine. The land sloped down into a shallow valley dotted with more twisted trees, many of them scorched. Jessie wanted to try crossing it to reach the river she was convinced lay on the other side. We started the descent, carefully picking our way down the loose slope. That's when I heard it. Rope creaking, as if weighed down by something. I spun around. At the top of the ravine, that blackened tree stood against the skyline. A noose swayed from a branch. I had no idea how it got there, or if it was even the same tree we'd seen before. It was just there, waiting. We forced ourselves to look away and continue downward. Jessie's leg slipped at one point, and she slid a few feet, scraping her arm on the sharp rocks. She cursed and let me help her up. I saw fear in her eyes, real fear, like she believed we might never leave this place. Just as we reached the bottom, we heard a voice echoing from above. "Ethan, Jessie!" It was Marcus's voice, but it carried a note of cruelty, dripping with malice. Goosebumps prickled across my skin. We ran through that valley of scorched trees, Ghost leading the way. The ground was uneven, littered with small volcanic vents that hissed steam. More than once I felt hot air whoosh past my ankles, nearly burning me. Jesse and I coughed as the sulfur fumes thickened. Eventually, we spotted something that looked like a trail, possibly an old game path. We followed it, hoping it would lead us to the river. The hours stretched on. My legs ached, my lungs felt raw, and my mind was on the verge of collapse. I kept thinking about Marcus. Was he possessed by something? Had I abandoned him to a fate worse than death? Then, out of nowhere, the path opened up into a clearing. My heart lifted for a moment, thinking we'd found a safe haven, but what we saw was an abandoned campsite. Rotted gear lay strewn about, an old tent partially collapsed, and a rusted cooking pot over a blackened fire ring. And hanging from a leaning post, another frayed rope noose. We approached slowly. A stiff wind rustled the remains of the tent's fabric. Inside, we found a torn sleeping bag, stained dark brown. It looked like dried blood. An overwhelming sense of dread pulsed through me. Ghost whimpered, edging away. "I've heard stories," Jessie said softly, her voice trembling. "People come here and never leave. Some say they end themselves. Others, something else, ends them. But it's real, Ethan. We have to get out." We stumbled around the campsite searching for anything useful. Most supplies were useless, moldy, rusted, broken. I found a small canister of butane that might still hold some fuel, so I pocketed it. Jessie spotted a half-buried journal, its pages stuck together with age. She pried it open, and on the cover, written in faded marker, were the words, "If you find this, run." Before we could read further, Ghost started barking wildly. I looked up and saw Marcus standing at the edge of the clearing. At least it wore Marcus's face. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes wide, lips parted in that smile. Something about the way he stood made my stomach twist. "Marcus?" I managed, though I knew better. He stepped forward, arms limp at his sides, that impossible grin dominating his features. "I'm so hungry," he said in a rasping whisper. "Come with me. We can stay here forever." Jessie raised her knife. He just laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed in the clearing. I reached for my own, small survival knife. My hand shook. I didn't want to hurt him, or whatever was left of him. But we had no choice. Marcus lunged, and Jessie slashed at his torso. The blade tore through his shirt, revealing pale, almost gray skin beneath. He staggered, but no blood came forth, just a thin trickle of that black substance. He moaned, but instead of pain, it sounded like twisted pleasure. He grabbed Jessie's arm with bone-crushing force. She screamed as I tried to stab him from behind, aiming to wound, to slow him down. The knife sank into his back, but he barely reacted, just threw Jessie aside like a rag doll. She hit the ground hard, her leg bending in a way that made me sick. Ghost charged, snarling, teeth bared. Marcus whirled, black ooze seeping down his back. Ghost clamped onto his ankle, and for the first time, the thing inhabiting Marcus let out a shriek of rage. It kicked Ghost away. The dog yelped and tumbled, but he scrambled back to his feet, growling. I took that moment to tackle Marcus's legs, trying to bring him down. He collapsed to his knees, and I stabbed again, blindly. He screeched, turning his head almost all the way around to look at me. His eyes burned with a sickly light. "Ethan," that voice croaked, sounding almost human for a moment. "You should have left that first day." Then it was gone, replaced by that monstrous grin. Jessie screamed, "Kill it! Kill it!" She tried to get up but collapsed, holding her leg. It was clearly broken. I tightened my grip on the knife. My hands were slick with sweat. Could I really do this? Then, remembering all we'd seen. His attack on Jesse, the horrifying transformations, the nooses, the rotting food, the time loops. I realized we had no choice. If the real Marcus was in there, he was long gone, or suffering more than we could fathom. Tears blurred my vision as I shoved the knife deeper into his back, twisting. A nauseating smell like sulfur and decay flooded my senses. Marcus howled, arching his spine. Something black and tar-like poured out of his mouth, sizzling as it hit the ground. I gagged, nearly retching. With a final jerk, he collapsed face first into the dirt, twitching. For a moment, none of us moved. Ghost whimpered and limped toward me, pressing against my leg. Jessie scooted closer, grimacing in pain from her injured leg. We stared at the corpse, half expecting it to rise again. Finally, its twitching subsided, and it lay still. I rolled Marcus over, trembling, and looked at his face. His eyes were half open, but they stared blankly into nothing. My best friend was dead. Or maybe he'd died long before that moment, and only now his body had followed suit. I felt sick, numb, dizzy with grief and horror. Jessie groaned. "We have to go," she said through clenched teeth. "We can't stay here." I nodded, swallowing back bile. I pried my knife out of Marcus's back, wiped it on the dirt, and helped Jessie stand. She couldn't put weight on her broken leg, so I supported her shoulder. Ghost was limping too, but still able to walk. As we staggered away from that clearing, I shot one last look at Marcus's body. It lay among the rotting tents and that cursed noose. I felt a pang of guilt that I wasn't giving him any sort of burial, but in my gut, I knew burying him wasn't possible, not here, not in this place. We walked, or hobbled really. Every step sent a jolt of pain through Jessie that made her hiss. After a grueling hour, the land began to slope downward. The air grew a bit more humid, and I thought I heard the distant rush of water. Jessie mumbled directions, but her voice was weakening. She'd lost a lot of energy, maybe blood, though not as obviously as a bleeding wound. Possibly shock was setting in. Ghost led us along a precarious path. Twice, I almost lost my footing, and Jessie nearly dragged us both down, but we pressed on. Eventually, the slope leveled out, and we emerged onto the banks of a wide, shallow river. Relief flooded me at the sight of running water. I had no idea which river it was, but it was real, and it had to lead somewhere. We followed it downstream, searching for any sign of a trail or a landing spot where a rescue plane might find us. The hours blurred together. My head pounded, my eyes burned, and I prayed we wouldn't see that noose again. Occasionally, I glanced over my shoulder, terrified that Marcus, no, that thing, might be lurking behind us. But we were alone. At some point, we found a stretch of gravel near the water's edge. I eased Jessie to the ground. She was in rough shape. Her leg was swollen, and she complained of dizziness. Ghost curled up beside her, protective. I rummaged through her pack, found bandages and a splint kit. With shaking hands, I stabilized her leg as best I could, though she screamed in pain when I adjusted it. "I'm sorry," I kept repeating. "I'm so sorry." She gritted her teeth. "You did what you had to," she said, voice wavering. We both did. We sipped water from the river. I used purification tablets to be safe, though at that point I almost didn't care if it was safe or not. The only thought in my mind was survival. That, and the haunting image of Marcus's twisted grin. We decided to rest until morning. There was a small patch of forest beyond the gravel, but we didn't dare go in too deep. We set up what little gear we had, mostly just a tarp Jessie carried to block the wind. The night was long and cold, but we managed to huddle together for warmth. Ghost pressed against me, occasionally raising his head to sniff the air. Dawn came slowly, but when the sky finally lightened, it seemed normal. The sense of chaotic time we'd experienced in the caldera felt distant here. I could only hope we were truly out of its sphere. Jesse's watch read 6:47 a.m., and for once, it felt like morning. My phone was completely dead by then. The small camera was likely out of battery too, but we were alive. That day, we continued downstream, moving at a snail's pace due to Jesse's injury. Around midday, we heard a faint roar overhead. I looked up to see a small plane flying across the sky. I waved frantically, but it was too distant to notice us. Still, the fact that we saw a plane at all gave me a burst of hope. We were near some route. Possibly, if we kept following the river, we'd reach civilization, or at least a spot where planes passed more frequently. It took us 2 more days, 2 excruciating days of hobbling along, rationing water and the few energy bars we had, to finally find a sign of human presence. A battered wooden signpost near an old trail. Jessie nearly cried with relief when she recognized a name scrawled in faded paint, referencing a fishing cabin a few miles ahead. We pressed on, half carrying each other. When we finally stumbled onto the cabin, it was empty but intact, clearly used seasonally by local fishermen or hunters. We found canned food, a working radio, and a first aid kit. Jessie collapsed onto a makeshift cot, while I rummaged through the supplies, tears of relief burning my eyes. Using the radio, we managed to send out a distress call. A rescue team arrived the next day. I never felt such an overwhelming mix of gratitude and terror as I did when that helicopter came into view. They flew us to a hospital in King Salmon, where doctors treated Jessie's broken leg and dehydration, and insisted on a psychological evaluation for both of us. I tried to explain what had happened to Marcus, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I describe the time slips, the nooses, the possession? The official report ended up something about unexplained phenomena in the caldera, an accident leading to the death of Marcus Holt, whose body was never recovered. I learned later that they sent a search party, but the weather turned, and they had to call it off. They never found any trace of him or our campsite, not even the tattered tents. For a while, I blamed myself. If I had listened to Jessie earlier, if I hadn't insisted on getting more footage, Marcus might still be alive. Or maybe none of us would have survived. I still don't know. Ghost survived too, though he remained skittish for months afterward. If a door creaked in the wind or if he saw a length of rope, he would bare his teeth, hackles raised. For me, nightmares became a nightly torture. I saw that blackened tree, the noose swaying, and Marcus's grin. I could never quite shake the feeling that some part of him, or the thing that wore him like a puppet, was still out there, stalking the caldera's rim in the endless Alaskan wilderness. After all this time, I've never released any footage from that trip. I can't bring myself to look at it. The camera is in a box in my storage unit, its battery drained. Sometimes I think about destroying it, but a part of me wants proof of what happened. Proof I didn't lose my mind. Yet, I'm too afraid to see what the camera might have recorded, or what it didn't. Jessie eventually returned to guiding, though she never again took a job in Anyakchak. When we parted ways, she gave me a look that said, "We survived, but at what cost?" We exchanged phone numbers and emails, promising to stay in touch, but I could tell neither of us really wanted to talk about that place. Not in detail, anyway. As for me, I haven't gone on another wilderness expedition since. My channel sits dormant, full of older videos with forced smiles and half-hearted survival tips. People comment sometimes, asking where I went, why I stopped. I usually ignore them. A few times, late at night, I've been tempted to answer, "I saw something I can never forget. I watched my best friend die, possessed by a place that warps time and feasts on the living. But I never have. Sometimes, I'll catch Ghost staring at the door, ears perked, as if he hears something on the other side. In those moments, my heart pounds. I wait to see if the doorknob will turn, if something beyond my comprehension will come for us. So far, it hasn't. But I can't shake the fear that one day the door will open on its own, and standing there will be Marcus, wearing that impossible smile, carrying that noose. I know how crazy it sounds, but it's my truth. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 29 years old, and in August 2023 I went to Anyakchak. I lost my best friend to something that I can't explain, something that still haunts my dreams. If you're thinking of going there, if you're lured by the thrill of untouched wilderness, please, for the love of whatever you hold dear, don't. Some places should be left alone. That's all I can say. I wish I had answers, closure, proof. But all I have is a memory. That final glimpse of Marcus lying face down in the dirt, black ooze pouring from him, a twisted grin on his lips, and above him the noose swaying in the wind. It's a memory I'll carry until my dying breath.